JNS special 2019 Israeli elections broadcast, coming to you live in front of a studio audience here at the Aish HaTorah World Center in the Old City of Jerusalem. For those of you that hear the applause at home, we have a tremendous group of university students in Israel, and joining me today on the panel to moderate this 3-hour marathon elections coverage session are my two good friends, former member of Knesset Dov Lipman, previously of the HAD party, also the Director of Community Outreach at Honest Reporting, and my good friend Dan Diker, the director of the Project of Political Warfare at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me tonight.
Great to be here.
As we go along, we're going to have incredible experts joining us on the panels, and we're going to unfold not only the political developments of the day, which are really incredible developments that have been taking place now for months, but also we're going to take a look at Israel's geopolitical situation as it relates to the United States, as it relates to our Palestinian neighbors, as it relates to all the nations of the world. We'll tackle other issues, including rising anti-Semitism, the BDS movement, the relationship between Israel and the American diaspora, and much, much more. So it is really, really wonderful to be with all of you today, and let's get right to it. So here we are. Israelis are at the polls. Polls opened early this morning, and they will be open until 10 p.m. At that time, the first exit polls will come out, and we'll start to get a sense of who's won the election, although that may take some more time until the votes are actually counted. And even then, it may take more time to figure out who actually will run the country and who will be members of the Knesset, how many seats each party will get. Let's talk a little bit about this election being as a referendum on the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. He's been the Prime Minister for the last 10 years. By many accounts, he's been an extremely successful Prime Minister, yet at the same time a very polarizing Prime Minister. Right now there are indictment charges looming over the Prime Minister, and in many ways this election is taking place as a referendum on the Prime Minister's rule. What do you guys think?
Alex, Alex, one of the stranger developments in this election is that the leading challenger, the novice politician, Benny Gantz, former chief of staff, has run what could be considered more of a presidential campaign. Came out looking like, a presidential campaigner, presidential candidate in the United States context. And what we've seen is such a I think almost unprecedented in decades type of mudslinging, really, referendum on the character of the Prime Minister, who was under several investigations now for even a couple of years. But what we really have seen here is that if you take 3 American television programs, Judge Judy and The People's Court, and the song "The Yellow Submarine," this is really what, to a large degree, this has really been about from the Blue and White leading contenders party. What this election is all about: a referendum on the character of the Prime Minister.
So, but what's fascinating is, as much as everything that Dan said is completely true, it's all about Netanyahu or not. What may decide the fate of the Knesset and the government is actually all these other smaller parties. So for those who are watching, we have these 2 main parties that are going against each other, Blue and White against Likud. But then there are many smaller parties that are running as well. Either Blue and White or Likud is going to have to turn to them to form a government. Whether they get into the Knesset or not and cross the threshold is one story, and who they support afterwards is the other story.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that there's about 47 parties that entered for the Knesset election. Now, obviously, most of those parties are not passing the Knesset threshold. For those at home that want to understand what the threshold is, if you do not get 3.25% of the votes, of the total, you don't make it into the Knesset. And that's approximately 4 seats. So you basically either can get 4 seats in the government or none. Now there's 2 parties, the Likud, led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and the Blue and White Party, led by Benny Gantz. Those 2 parties are both polling with numbers hovering around the 30 Knesset member mark. Then you have the Labor Party hovering around 10 in the polls. You have 2 or 3 parties hovering around 8 or 7. And then you have about 6 parties hovering right around the threshold. And nobody knows if they'll either get into the Knesset or if they will be the sort of dark horses that might come out with 6, 7, or 8 seats. And it's very clear that it's the fate of those small parties, the sort of tail end of the political spectrum, that's going to determine the government. And in many cases, this is also a question of the blocs. The right-wing bloc, which is basically represented by the parties that are in the outgoing government, and the opposition left-wing bloc. And yet there's still many, many different possibilities that can come out, including a national unity government where the 2 largest parties actually sit together.
The simple math, as we do it, definitely shows that the country is more to the right. That's for sure. And assuming that all the parties get in, Netanyahu will have the easiest time to form a coalition. What Blue and White is trying to do, and my phone right now is being bombarded with messages, what they're trying to say is we need to have a knockout. We have to win by 5 seats or more. And then at that point, we'll be the ones to be asked to form a government, and everyone will fall in line and will find a way to do it. If they don't do that, if we go to sleep tonight and wake up early tomorrow morning and it's closed, it's 1 seat, it's 2 seats in one direction, then on a certain level, Netanyahu has really won this referendum, because the right-wing side should be able to form a government at that point. So the strategy right now is Blue and White trying to say we need a massive gap so that there's no way Likud can be asked to form the government. And the strategy from the Likud side is certainly, on the one hand, get as many seats as possible, but also make sure that the smaller right-wing parties get in as well.
Right, and you see that in the final moments that the Likud has been going to the electorate and trying to tell the voters, don't vote for the smaller parties. Right? You need to vote for the main party on the right, which is the Likud. And in many cases, Blue and White as well is also trying to take votes away from Labor and from Meretz in order to consolidate its power, because really in the parliamentary system, it's the party that's the largest that is able to form the government.
Well, traditionally, Alice, this is where there's perhaps a misunderstanding. So what Dov said is very important vis-a-vis Netanyahu. Netanyahu is deeply concerned about those 5 mandates that might go to Blue and White. Therefore, they're being asked by the president to get the tap to form a coalition following the recommendations of the parties. Now, there is an internal contradiction, you can argue, in Netanyahu's strategy in recent days, which was, they say in Hebrew, to drink is the translated word, to drink the votes or to pull the votes from some of the smaller parties, so that the Likud is not in a position of trailing or losing by 4 or 5 mandates. On the other hand, the contradiction is that you could actually topple some of those smaller parties and prevent them from passing the minimum threshold of 3.25%, which translates, as you said, into 4 mandates. Now, just in simple math, if 2 of those parties don't make the minimum threshold, those are arguably 6 mandates that go down the drain on the right side of the map, and then they arise on the left side of the map. So in quick math, that could create very reasonably a blocking 60 for Blue and White, assuming each of the major parties gets approximately 30 votes. So this election is open, very much so, and Netanyahu, for his part, is in a sort of a self-imposed stranglehold. On the one hand, not wanting to trail by 4 or 5 or lose by 4 or 5. On the other hand, having to keep all those smaller parties at the 5 or 6 seat threshold.
And what's happening right now behind the scenes, as everyone's watching us sit here comfortably, I'm on the list for every single party that sends out messages. They are all saying either we're at the risk of not crossing the threshold, go out and vote right now, there's an hour and a half left, this is the critical time, or for the major parties, they're both claiming that they're not accomplishing what they wanted to accomplish, and therefore calling people to come out to vote for them. So this last hour and a half is actually a critical point where everyone's trying to get their messages out.
Well, and Election Day is a national holiday in Israel. The kids are off from school, people are home from work, partly because the voting stations are at schools. And so people do get out to vote, and it's kind of like, it feels like a national holiday today. It wasn't rush hour traffic. It actually felt great, and the weather today was really, really nice too, which really encourages people to get out and vote. And in general, Israelis do get out and vote. In fact, in higher numbers than in the United States. So And according to the recent reports, it shows that maybe the voter turnout is slightly lower, a couple points lower than it has been, but that's a general trend over elections, that each time it gets just a little bit smaller. But it seems as though about 75% of Israelis are going to get out and vote.
They will, and remember, you mentioned that it's a day off. I mean, there's no other country in the world where you'll see the prime minister of the country who's running for re-election strolling along the Netanya beach, which, as the prime minister was doing today, trying to get people to enjoy your day at the beach and then please go vote at the end of the day. And that's very much so. Even though the numbers at the moment do seem to be a little bit lower, you could see a surge as time goes along, and you might see it grow. But there definitely is a part of the Israeli consciousness, much more than certainly the United States, where we're from, to go out and vote and be part of the process. There was also a very high percentage of people, and Dan, I mean, you've been following elections for a long time, of people who until this morning still had no idea who they were voting for.
Yeah, this was the big concern of the two major parties, were this very large, according to the most recent polls, which until this past Friday were the last poll, big undecided constituency of going to vote. And this is what really, I would say, in political terms, frightened the prime minister, and also concerned Benny Gantz and the other, and Yair Lapid and the Blue and White Party, is this sense of a lackadaisical sense, a sense of not being highly motivated. And let's bear in mind, this was the context of this campaign was very negative, not issue-driven, character-driven. Yep. And I think that may have had sort of a drugging effect, if you will, on the public.
I think it's an important point that you're raising about Israelis coming up to the election day not knowing who they're going to vote for, right? Because you've had polls running almost daily in the country for months, specifically since the February 21st deadline for announcing the Knesset faction list, the candidate list for Knesset. So we've been breathing elections. So how could it be, in a sense, that you get to election day and you still don't know who you're going to vote for?
I think it very much relates to the way you opened, which is about this referendum about Netanyahu. When it comes to the ideology, I think people know where the ideologies are, but there's a lot of confusion. So, for example, people who are definitely view themselves on the right, it could be that they have hesitance about whether or not they want to have Netanyahu continue as prime minister. People who understand that they're on the left, they might not see Benny Gantz as ready to be prime minister. So you do have this head-to-head and this personal clash on the one hand, and people don't know how that fits with their ideologies.
You know, Alex, you have a new one of Israel's chief analysts, Yaakov Bardugo, in the Hebrew media, made this point that in this particular election you really have a lot of new players, new elites versus old elites. You know, the surprise of this election is a veteran right-wing activist who became a Likud member, and he now, Moshe Feiglin, and he now is polling at 6 or 7 or even 8 seats, literally in the last week. He's being called Rand Paul with a yarmulke, and real libertarianism. This breaks the traditional left-right debate in Israel, as well, by the way, as the so-called the new right, which is this combination of secular and religious people with Naftali Bennett, the Minister of Education, the Minister of Justice, Ayelet Shaked, running together. This is a new type of repackaging within the Israeli political constellation that's happening and has not happened in previous elections.
I think I'd like to take a step back for some of the people that are watching this broadcast in America, and also maybe for some of the people in the audience, just to understand a little bit about how the parliamentary system and the elections for parliamentary system work. In the United States, you have a direct election for the President of the United States, and you also have direct elections for specific members of Congress and members of the Senate. Each person you'll vote for individually in a ballot, collective ballot. In Israel, the way it works is that you actually place a vote at the voting booth for a party, right? And there's no direct election at this time, although there has historically been a few times where there was a direct election. But you vote for a party, and then it's the largest party whose leader is usually charged with the first task of forming a government. And a government requires a coalition of 60 or more members of the Knesset that all recommend the leader of that said party, the largest party, to be the prime minister. So there are many people that will go to the booths, and let's say on the right, will want for Netanyahu to be the prime minister. But as Dan, you were mentioning, they also want Moshe Feiglin to get into the Knesset, or they also want Ayelet Shaked to have a strong position so that she can remain on as justice minister. And on the left side, there are many people that have been longtime voters for the Labor Party. However, they recognize that Benny Gantz has the opportunity now to unseat Netanyahu. So people have to decide on their loyalties when they get to the voting booth. What is more important? Is it more important that my sectorial special interest party get into the Knesset, or is it more important that I cast the vote with the person that I want to be the prime minister?
That was the number one question that I was being asked today, mostly by people on the right, actually. People who were saying, I need Netanyahu to be prime minister, so do I listen to his call over these last few days, which was, we need a large Likud, or else we won't be able to succeed. But I'm really like Naftali Bennett and Ayelet Shaked, or I really like Rabbi Peretz from the United Right Party, and which way do I go? And it's very difficult to give guidance to people in terms of that. Ultimately, I think people are going to go with where their hearts really tell them they want to be comfortable with their vote. But you have exactly, as you said, that question both on the right and on the left, and that's ultimately where the elections will be determined.
Right. And you see the smaller parties on the right telling you, for example, do not vote for Netanyahu because he's going to try, for example, to form a national unity government. Right? So if you want to make sure that the right is stronger and the right is larger, so vote for the smaller parties. So you have all these contradictions that each voter has to sort out for themselves in front of this cardboard box, right, with 47 different parties in front of it, and you have to pick up the piece of paper that you want and stick it in the envelope. So it's not like in America also where you have these voting machines. We have really old-fashioned, and each party has its own letters, and there's a lot of calculations that people make, and I know many people that woke up this morning not knowing who they were going to vote for. And so you have the questions running, for weeks. Who are you going to vote for? Who are you going to vote for? But then today it's who did you vote for?
When I was a candidate running, I'd always question, why do you have us running around all day to these polling booths? Does it really matter? And the statistics show people on their way in to vote, if they see one party with a larger presence, if they happen to shake hands with a candidate along the way, they very much may be swayed to vote that way. So it's a fascinating process.
Just in terms of referendum in this election on character and personality, I think we have to note the fact that one of the major strategic political influences in this campaign is somebody from the United States, Mark Mellman, who is one of the great pollsters of the United States. He's one of the senior pollsters of the Democratic Party, and he has been Yair Lapid's advisor, political advisor, and pollster now for a number of years. And Mark has a very substantial polling operation in Washington, D.C., and it was his strategy, Dov Lippman, that was based on what they call the submarine strategy. They did some polling at the Mellman Group, and they found that if Benny Gantz were to focus on the submarine issue, which means in very simple terms that the accusation that Prime Minister Netanyahu had some purported financial interest in purchasing submarines and passing them for having Egypt purchase these submarines, that would move the political dial and take mandates to blue and white. So the point here is that an American pollster, once again, the Likud once had Arthur Finkelstein, and now we have Mark Mellman, who is one of the major political forces behind the strategy of one of the two major parties in Israel.
In 2013, the night that the party that I was running with, Yesh Atid, was a surprise of the election, in the election campaign headquarters, after the results were announced, there was all this celebrating and balloons, and the corner of the room was an American Jew with a kippah on his head named Mark Mellman drinking a Diet Coke, just removed from it all, and he was the entire brains behind everything that happened. So you're 100% right that that's certainly, we don't always see the figures who are really pulling the strings in the elections.
Well, there's another key individual that has had an outsized role in the elections. That's been the Attorney General. Right? The Attorney General has been working with the police now for months, sifting through evidence and deciding whether or not he was going to recommend that the Prime Minister would be indicted in several separate corruption cases, breach of trust cases. And in fact, he did only weeks before the election announce his intention that he would indict pending hearings in those cases. And many ways people suggested that it could be interference either if he announced his intention to indict or if he would have held back his recommendations until after the elections. I'd like to turn now actually to two individuals that are maybe even much greater experts than us on these topics. To my far right, and that's not politically, it's just on the table, on the dais here, is Gerald Steinberg, the professor of politics at Bar-Ilan University, and right next to me, Professor Ephraim Inbar, who is the president of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you so much for joining us today. And what are your thoughts about this election being a referendum on Prime Minister Netanyahu?
I think it's true. And what is remarkable in my view is that the steps taken by the Attorney General actually had no effect on the electorate. We see that the polls before he tried, to charge Netanyahu remain the same. We don't see big changes in the electorate as a result of the accusations made against Netanyahu, which shows a troubling phenomenon that many Israelis, do not trust the judicial system. And this is something that I'm very troubled, and I'm not sure it's true, but this is something that will remain for us for some time. And this issue has to be made clear in the following years.
Take a slightly different perspective. First of all, I think it is true that this is a referendum on Netanyahu. And he's been in office now. He will have been in office for 10 years. If he gets reelected, he'll exceed that of Ben-Gurion. There are people who would vote for Likud that are nervous about the fact that he's been in office for 10 years. And democracies need to have some sort of a turnover. One of the reasons that the Blue and White Party, Benny Gantz's party, or as I call it, the four hombres, the four generals or three generals, and in very 1950s, that image. If you look at their pictures, they really got a 1950s look to them. But one of the reasons that they are right up there, maybe ahead of Netanyahu or Likud, maybe, but those are the two big parties, is that they've managed to articulate a lot of the sense of, we may not be so opposed to Netanyahu's policies, we may actually want Netanyahu's policies, but we need to have some changeover in the electoral process. There are people from Likud who've, I was going to say defected, I'll say that anyway. There are two or three very top people in that party now that have worked with Netanyahu who also talk about needing a change. And we do have the cloud of the indictment, the pending indictments and the trials. I think those are going to really become visible maybe tonight or tomorrow morning in terms of creating a coalition, and certainly over the next couple of months, where there may be some defections, there may be some changes in the policy in the cabinet and the coalition, which are going to affect. So we're not necessarily going to know where things stand at all at the end of this evening. We may see this is going to take a while to play out, and the issue of indictments, the issue of the legal process is going to continue to be something that's going to play an important role. I just want to say one other quick thing about why Netanyahu is still very much considered to be the dominant leader in Israel. And I think that's because of strategic reasons. And I think the image that one looks at is, you see, we've had a war going on to the north of us in Syria since 2011. So it's 7-8 years. It's now winding down. The Russians, the Iranians, the Syrians, Hezbollah, it's all there. And many Israelis, even those who are very critical of him, give Netanyahu credit for managing that. And then we've got this relationship with the White House, with the Trump administration, and we got the relationship with Putin and the Kremlin, and he was just there this week, Netanyahu. Who else? The question which many Israelis that I speak to, who are critical of Netanyahu in many other areas, would say, who else can possibly put together a strategic coalition like that? We need to keep him in office, because otherwise that's going to really cost us.
That's certainly why President mentioned the corruption charges not taking hold, which everyone thought they would, because I think Israelis, they hear all the noise, they might say, okay, maybe there is something to it, but at the end of the day, who's able to do everything that Gerald just mentioned? And people come back to Netanyahu at the end of the day, and when they go to vote, that's ultimately what's on their minds.
And I think that you're only mentioning some of the accomplishments. I mean, by many, many accounts, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been an extraordinarily successful prime minister. I mean, first of all, just to be at the head of a political system that is always intent on replacing the person at the top, just being able to hold multiple coalitions together and then at the same time building the economy, building the diplomatic relationships that Israel's had over the last number of years. I mean, by many accounts, people feel that we're being led by a very unique leader, but at the same time, he's a polarizing leader, right? He hasn't been able to unite the entire nation behind him.
Well, I think maybe the secret for Netanyahu's long tenure is the failure of the Oslo process. Let's face it, the left has been discredited because it followed this policy, which is a strategic blunder, and they are paying for it for years. And the only time when somebody was successful in labor, or now with Blue and White, to really put up a challenge against Likud, when they had a figure that was associated with security. And now they have 3 generals, 3 former chief of staffs. And this what gives them the ability to really to contend a successful leader such as Netanyahu. But basically, it is, in historic terms, it's the Oslo process that brought back Likud to power, and we don't know what the results will be, but unquestionably that this alternative will not continue Oslo process policies.
You know, I think that Professor Imbar is one of Israel's great authorities on diplomacy and national security, makes a very important point here that we have to point out not only to our viewers and our studio audience. This is the first election in 25 years in which the diplomatic process or the security process, or the diplomatic process between Israel and the Palestinians is a complete non-issue between the 2 leading parties. Back in 2015, the elections in 2015, and even in the prior elections, the 2 prior elections, the issue of what has become colloquially known as the peace process, or establishing 2 states for 2 people process, is today completely dead as a major campaign issue. And in all of the 5 or 6 elections in the last 25 years or more, it has been a major issue. So it really shows you how, as Professor Imbar says, that the Oslo concept of 2 states or establishing a putative Palestinian state somewhere in the West Bank, in the context of Professor Imbar's comments, as well as Professor Steinberg, of a region that is completely imploding. It is a development that most of the Israeli electorate consider to be a red herring and a dead letter.
But there's always a but in this, right? We're going to have a Trump peace plan. We've been promised or threatened with a Trump peace plan right after the elections. All right, it's been 2 years and we're waiting for, but they seem to be very serious about putting the deal of the century on the table. And one of the issues which I think is in the background and sometimes in the foreground of this, the elections, who do you really want to have dealing with this attempt to put those issues back on the table? Nobody in Israel, almost nobody in Israel, maybe Meretz and a few other small parts, want to see another Oslo-type deal, but they have to deal with what Trump puts on the table. Netanyahu's got that experience, but the question is then what happens, and the relationship with the United States is also very important. It's Trump now who's going to come afterwards. All those issues are in the background, and it works both for and against Netanyahu's position in the public image.
Professor Imbar?
Yeah.
First of all, the deal of the century. The century ends not very soon, so maybe we'll see a deal at the end of the century. I think it's quite clear that any government that will be elected will have the same position vis-à-vis the Trump plan.
But not vis-à-vis Trump.
No, vis-à-vis Trump. Nobody will estrange a narcissistic president like Trump, and they'll say yes, of course, and they will rely on the Palestinian rejectionism. They simply, we all know already what the Palestinians are going to say. So basically, the deal that Trump offered is an interim stage for what will happen afterwards, and the dynamics are after it is being rejected, then it will start the real political dynamics. After the deal is rejected by the Palestinians, after the Arab countries understand that they cannot enforce a deal upon the Palestinians, and at the same time, we may see, Abu Mazen is not a young chicken, and he eventually will go away from the Palestinian scene, and we have two, one international dynamic, one domestic Palestinian dynamic, and this is what will bring about new circumstances for all the players. But the deal is dead before it was offered, and the response of both sides to the deal is also well known. As well, we'll say yes, but, and the Palestinians will say no.
I'll just add that with Trump, I don't think any of us really know what's going to happen, and that requires a certain amount of skill. Alex, you talked about the other accomplishments that Netanyahu has had, and I'm going to put it slightly differently. There has been said by a number, particularly of Israelis, that being Prime Minister of Israel is the toughest job in the world. We are seen on the outside world very often as a superpower, with all this military capability, but usually by people who don't really understand the region, don't understand the geography. We're sitting here in the old city of Jerusalem. We're sitting a few meters away. We're talking to an American audience, a few yards away from the Western Wall, from the Kotel, from the Har HaBayit, from all of these things. We're sitting here 50 years after the 67 war, and 40, how many years has it been now? Yeah, 50 plus years. And all these, 52, and all these questions of how Israel is going to continue to maintain its ability not just to survive, but to deal with all the threats, continue to be out there. And what Netanyahu has done over the last 10 years has shown that these issues can be handled. There are ups, there's some downs, but he's got that experience. And the question that's also asked, with all of the negatives that come in, is do we want to take the risk of having people who've never really sat in that chair and don't really have that experience? Now, that has to happen at some point. But do we want to take that risk now with so many uncertainties in the region, both strategic and political and diplomatic? We haven't talked yet about the demonization, BDS, the political attacks. So those are all part of the process. Some of it we'll see in the results of the election, and some of it will have to be played out in the government. And the degree to which Netanyahu can put together a broad-based government, because he's going to need it to deal with these issues.
As much as there's no doubt that the Palestinian issue has not been a major part of the campaign, as everyone has mentioned, I'm just looking right now at what's going on behind the scenes. The Prime Minister just did a conference call with all the candidates in the Likud, in which he said it's down by 20%. Where what's going to happen is another. And then he brings up there's going to be another Oslo. There's going to be a peace deal with the Palestinians. So that is being used, and even if it's not a real issue in the campaign, it is something which is effective in motivating voters. That is for sure. So on the one hand, it's not a real issue in the campaign, and no one thinks anything's going to actually happen, but it is something which candidates are using in order to bring voters to their side.
I think Dan mentioned earlier in the program that in many ways the Oslo process has proven itself to be a failure. And yet, at several intervals in those 25 years, the State of Israel has offered significant tracts of land in exchange for the hopes of peace, which never came. And after those attempts at a formal peace agreement with Palestinians, basically Israel wound up going back into a holding pattern until whenever the next time would be that the same governments, more or less, would come together and try it again. And you get the sense now that with Trump in the White House, and you see how he has bucked many long-standing policies, foreign policies towards the State of Israel and towards the region, you get the sense that this opportunity might be different because, as you, Professor Ambar, stated, we know about Palestinian rejectionism, but perhaps this peace plan is all about the day after, and are we able to turn the page on the Oslo plan?
Bibi has been very successful in its foreign policy, but I feel that sometimes he was overcautious. And this is part of his nature. He is a risk averter. Despite, all people that say that he's extremist. He's very cautious, basically. And we face a bigger challenge than the Palestinians, the Iranian challenge. And any next government will have to deal with this challenge. Can a next prime minister order the IDF to go after the Iranian nuclear installations? Trump will not do it for us. It's quite clear that on this issue we are alone. Will the next prime minister be able to give orders to take care of this? The Palestinians is a strategic nuisance, and we can deal with it by managing the conflict. And we try to limit the suffering for both sides by offering carrots, economic carrots, by using force in a very measured way, by, of course, taking care of the bad guys in the territories. But this is not our main challenge. And to Netanyahu's credit, we must say that he identified quite early this challenge. But what has he done about it? He was lucky, very lucky, to have Trump as president. And he tries to revert, what has been done by the international community. But it will not work.
If we go a little bit for an hour from now, the polls close. We're going to start getting some results.
And telephone calls.
And, well, we're going to stop getting telephone calls from candidates. And then we start talking about putting together a government. And precisely for the reasons that Ephraim raised, it's possible that we're going to see a coalition between Netanyahu and Gantz. It's important to realize that for the last few months, we've had a prime minister, a foreign minister, and defense minister, and a few other ministries all in one person. That cannot continue. And we talked earlier about the court issues and the indictments and other things. Netanyahu needs to go to the day after. With all the last-minute attempts to build up the results of the elections, for dealing with the Iranian threat in a serious way, for dealing perhaps with the deal of the century and creating more unity in the government, for having people who have qualified and been there, he's got to reach out. Some of those people may be in Likud, but he's got to go beyond that. So I think that when we start to talk about what sort of governments may be out there, if Netanyahu or Gantz, whoever comes out on top of it, each of them together are only going to get a quarter of the vote. If they combine together, they have a serious chance of putting together a stable government. They've worked together in the past. And precisely for these strategic reasons and threats, there's a possibility that they're going to work together. I see that.
Well, let's not forget, 2009, Netanyahu turned to form his government. He turned to the Labour Party and brought in Ehud Barak. 2013, he turned towards Tzipi Livni and Yair Lapid. This is part of what the right wing is saying we're afraid of, but it's not an impossibility whatsoever. And let's remember also, Benny Gantz, who's now new to the political scene, the best move for him in that situation would be to become defense minister and build himself instead of all of a sudden going to the opposition for a period of time. So as much as we're going to analyze tonight and see results tonight, there's many more weeks ahead to try to see exactly where things are going.
Come back here once a week and we'll see where things are going, because we're probably not going to know how it's going to look at the end of this evening.
There is a built-in contradiction here also. In the last 96 hours, both Gantz and Netanyahu have both said declaratively that they will not sit with the other party. Now, we haven't seen that in the past, 2009, 2013. We saw a lot of posturing, and we saw all kinds of, sort of more politically clouded statements. In the end, as Dov Lipman says, as you said, Professor Steinberg, you can overcome these type of declarative differences. At the same time, you've got a serious credibility challenge to each candidate who have said just in the past days, without in no uncertain terms, they will not sit with the other side. Having said that, just one last point before I turn it over to Professor Steinberg for his response.
I have a one-sentence response. I'll give it to you in a second.
Is that it is clearly both in Netanyahu and Gantz's profound interest to sit with one another. Let's remember, Prime Minister Netanyahu has received several gifts from the American administration. That's not just the recognition of the Golan Heights, not just Israeli sovereignty in the Golan Heights, or Jerusalem as Israel's eternal capital, recognition of that. But the fact is that the United States administration has twice delayed the publication of this so-called peace deal of the century at the behest of Mr. Netanyahu, and Mr. Netanyahu is going to have to, if he becomes prime minister again, he is going to have to deliver to the president who's been waiting to publicize this deal of the century.
Dan, there's a sentence, there's a line many of our students here probably know this. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happens in elections, in campaigns, when the day is over after the campaign, it's all forgotten. Nobody's going to talk about it. I'm sure the people in the newspapers, the Haaretz, will write editorials and op-eds and will attack both candidates, both Netanyahu and Gantz, for having pledged not to work with each other. But they're going to say, for the absolute national interest, we've got to find a way to deal with these issues. And I'm not predicting this, but I'm saying it's a real possibility. I'm watching it very carefully.
The only thing, the only thing that will keep blue and white together is cabinet posts. So, we all know what will happen to such a party if it doesn't get into government. It will disintegrate. We've seen it, centrist parties that are, built by many parties usually disintegrate immediately after its elections if they don't get cabinet posts.
So let's explain a little bit how the blue and white came together. I mean, everybody knows about the Likud. The Likud's been around already since 1973 when it was founded and rose to power in 1977 under Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and has been a primary party, if not a ruling party, since then. The Blue and White Party is a brand new party. Dov, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how that formation came together.
So for the last few years, there's been a party out there, which I was a member of until about 11 months ago, saying we are the alternative to Netanyahu, and that's the Yesh Atid party. It was only 11 seats in this current Knesset, but in polls, they were the closest to the Likud in any measure. But it was clear at a certain point that they were not going to overtake Likud, and they were dropping. All of a sudden, a new figure came on the scene, former IDF Chief of Staff Benny Gantz. He announced his new party, Chosim L'Yisrael, and they immediately looked like they had promised, but also, through a variety of reasons, started dropping. They all looked at each other, and they said, neither of us individually are capable of coming close to the Likud. Netanyahu will be the next prime minister. The only thing we can possibly do is to join forces together. So first, Gantz turned to someone on the right wing, Moshe Ya'alon, who was a former Likud defense minister, also former IDF chief of staff, and they joined together. That seemed to give them a little bit of a boost. And then the final decision that really had to be made was Yair Lapid saying, I will swallow my pride, at least for the moment, and Yesh Atid will join together. And then all of a sudden, they bolted out with nearing 40 seats, and it looked like this was going to be the party which would topple Netanyahu. But that was their peak. And over time, they started going down. People started noticing their flaws. Right wing, left wing, center, where are they? Another personality, former IDF Chief of Staff Gabi Ashkenazi, joined as well. And as they became more and more exposed, their numbers really reduced. So you have this conglomerate of many different aspects coming together, forming this new blue and white entity. I actually do think that part of the confusion which they generated is also part of their failure in terms of really being able to surge way beyond the Likud.
So who is the blue and white? I mean, where are they in the spectrum?
They don't know, so we probably don't know. I go back to the four hombres. You've got three generals who are different. Gabi Ashkenazi is different than Bogi Ya'alon, is different than Gantz, and there's a good reason that Gantz is the head of the party. The other two are unlikely to be able to lead, although I think Ashkenazi thinks he can do it. And that's another reason to be concerned, that you may see a very quick power fight there. And then they added, to make themselves much more amenable to a center-right dominant political group in Israel, pulling off people here and there. So it's a broad range. Again, the first woman is number 5 or number 6, I think, in the party. And then they don't do a very good job of presenting a broad spectrum of Israeli society. And the fact that they've only been together for a few months also means we can't answer really what their policies are. I think their campaign was not particularly successful. It's primarily, and it makes sense that they would try to take the votes away from Netanyahu. That's where they have a chance of scoring. But in terms of putting out policies that are clear to the public and presenting alternatives, they really didn't invest very much in that. And there are a lot more questions than there are answers. I think Ephraim is right, that very likely, particularly if they're not in the cabinet, they're going to just end up turning into different factions and largely disappear. Lapid has held his party together. Dov was a member of that party? Is a member of the party? Was. And actually, for a number of us, we were surprised that they were able to hold together. But maybe the quality of the people involved was part of that reason. Presenting a more centrist political entity, we don't know whether they would call themselves centrist or not. And as you said, Bogi Ya'alon is from the right, I think to the right of Netanyahu in a lot of his policies. I don't know what Ashkenazi's political views are at all. And then you have Nissenkorn, who is from the Histadrut, which means that he has more of a left-wing, labor-oriented political platform and background. So we have a lot of individuals, but we don't really have a coherent party. Another important thing, I teach politics. A party that lasts and is able to make important policy moves and is also able to run in the next elections has to have a structure. It has to have all of the backroom activities that get out the vote and everything else. You don't have a party that shows up overnight and is able to do that, run in municipal elections, all of that. So whether they're able to turn this group, this very diverse group, it's not even a coalition, into a real party, is also a very big question, and I'd be skeptical just based on history.
I think that part of the blue and white success is the fact that they are not leftists, despite the attempt by Likud to portray them as leftists. I think that, as I mentioned before, they are generals, they are security-oriented, and this is why a large part of the Israeli electorate is trusting them. The second reason I think that blue and white is successful is because undoubtedly there is a phenomenon in Israeli society of wariness of Netanyahu. Many say...
You mean fatigue?
Fatigue, weariness, I know, fatigue.
Weariness. And weariness.
Excuse my English accent. So many people say, he was a fantastic prime minister, he was great, but enough. Partly because he's, to some extent, hedonist behavior. Part of it is many charges, legal charges. But there is this worriness, and I can see it in circles which are right-wing. And the combination of Netanyahu with his wife, Sarah, is very bad in terms of politics. Let's face it. We all know stories about the Prime Minister's wife and her influence, which I believe it's greatly exaggerated, but we all know those stories. So this is something that goes against Netanyahu. And, I'm surprised that he still has 30 seats. This shows that he's great campaigner, of course, but also still very popular.
And the weakness of the opposition. We didn't talk about the Labour Party, but I think that's an important part of the election story. And they've been able to come back from 4 or 5 seats, maybe even a question of whether they're going to pass the 3.25 threshold. And now the polls are showing perhaps 9 or 10 seats. And they're not at all talking about these political issues. They're talking about economic issues. And they put together, in the primary process, they ran a quite visible primary process, they got all new people out there, people that were not around 10 years ago. And I've heard from the people that I speak to, some of my students, from the cohort of the next generation, my own children and their groups, and they're talking about people like Itzik Shmuley, who emphasizes things not in the trite way of social justice, but putting more money into things like health, particularly, and dealing with the issue so that old people retirees who need significantly greater budgets to be able to live leave the end of their lives in a decent way, are able to do that. Another aspect of that different party is Orly Levy's party, Gesher, which is on the edge of maybe making it or not, but their entire platform is on these social, economic, health, all of those issues, the big gap between rich and poor, which, as the United States, is growing also in Israel. And it'll be interesting to see how these smaller parties are able to influence. They may have a significant impact, and they may be a surprise there.
First of all, I'd like to give a big round of applause to Professor Ephraim Inbar and Professor Gerald Steinberg for joining us. We have about 75 college students here in the audience, and I just want to get a sense from you. Are you guys learning something about the Israeli political system tonight? Give me a round of applause if you're learning something.
Got a question?
Now, one of the people that's been following the Israeli political scene very closely for years is the political correspondent of the Jerusalem Post, Gil Hoffman. And our roving reporter, Steve Leibowitz, was out on the streets in the days before the election trying to take the pulse of the nation. And sure enough, he bumped into Gil. And let's hear what Gil has to say about the upcoming election.
Gil Hoffman, after all that you've written, after all that's happened, we're just about at Election Day. Are you expecting any major surprises?
The beauty of Israeli democracy, Steve, is that anything can happen. Netanyahu could win, Gantz could win, there could be a unity government between them. It could be that one will get a chance to form a government and fail, and then another one will get a chance to form a government and succeed. It could be that both of them will get a chance to form a government and fail, and we'll have another election in 2019. It could be that Netanyahu will be reelected, and then his government will fall apart after an indictment. We'll have another election in 2020. Anything can happen.
But we want to get this over with. I mean, it's good business for the political writers.
The political writers are enjoying this, Steve. It's a fun election.
Just moments. Imagine yourself just moments before 10 o'clock when the polls are about to be released, the election, the exit polls, and the results are about to come in. What are you expecting to see on the screen?
You're asking me to predict.
Give it a shot.
Look, Blue and White, the polls say that they'll get a couple more seats, 3 maybe, than Likud, but it doesn't matter because with all due respect to the 6.3 million voters, one man will decide who's prime minister, and he's the president of Israel. His vote matters more than all of ours.
And you think that ultimately Rivlin will turn to the person with the best chance to form the government to give a first try?
No one knows what Rivlin will do. A lot depends on the results, and a lot depends on the recommendations, because even if you have the right being the larger bloc by far, there's no guarantee that these party leaders who detest Netanyahu with a passion will recommend him, and don't believe anything that they're saying right now publicly or privately.
To the process of forming a government and who has the best chances of that. In just an hour's time, we'll have the first results of the exit polls, which will be very exciting. But meanwhile, we have two other very special panelists here, and just like everybody wants to know about the Knesset slates and where do women sit on their Knesset slates, we have two extraordinarily talented women here on our panel tonight. Columnist Melanie Phillips, who writes for the Times of London, the Jewish Chronicle, and as well for JNS on a regular basis, and also Eve Harrow, a famous tour guide and also radio show host of the Rejuvenation program on thelandofisrael.com. Thank you so much for joining us. And I also want to take... And I'd like to take the opportunity to sort of pivot away from the parliamentary politics for a moment because, as Professor Steinberg so correctly mentioned, being Prime Minister of Israel is one of the hardest jobs in the entire world, and that's partially because there are so many different threats to the State of Israel and to the Jewish people around the world that play themselves out in other forms aside from the parliamentary realms. And you two have been following some of these very, very closely. In particular, Melanie, I wanted to talk a little bit about anti-Semitism around the world. We've really seen an uptick in global anti-Semitism at the same time when many other nations of the world are sort of turning towards Israel, like your Brazil is turning towards Israel. Arab countries turning towards Israel, Russians and the Chinese and the Indian, all turning towards Israel and recognizing that Israel has a lot to offer. And yet at the same time, especially Western nations are sort of turning away from Israel. What's going on?
Well, it is a very strange phenomenon, as you say, an extraordinary sort of confluence of apparent opposites. And there's not one simple explanation for it. Part of the reason, I think, is why Israel is so disliked in the West, is that in Europe, there is a titanic struggle going on over the very idea of the Western nation. A collision between two worldviews, one which says that the Western nation is intrinsically evil and racist and colonialist and white, and therefore gives rise to prejudice and bigotry and war. And it must therefore be removed, as it were, or rather subsumed into an internationalist world order in which transnational institutions and transnational laws take precedence. Now, Israel, and to this way of thinking, Israel is triply damned. It is a nation. It is a Western nation, although in fact it's not Western at all, but in the eyes of the West it's Western. And it's an ethnic nation. It is the Jewish homeland. And so it's triply damned. And so at the very same time you've got this tremendous fight going on. You've got Israel being vilified. And the fight that's going on in Europe, because it is a civilizational battle, and because those countries really have no sense of themselves anymore, in such a situation where people lose a sense of their own identity, they turn on the weakest. And they're turning on the Jews of Europe for that reason alone. Plus the fact that you have throughout the West the dominance culturally of the left, for whom Israel is a colonialist project, a white settler project, and so it can do no right. Plus you have the influx into Europe and into Britain of very large numbers of Muslims who are bringing with them a narrative which is anti-Jew and anti-Israel. And so that kind of explains in a very shorthand way why there is this tremendous problem that's accelerating in Europe. And yet you have, as you say, this extraordinary situation with Israel. And I think that's largely because, not entirely, but largely because many countries, including in the old Eastern Europe, the old Soviet bloc, and other countries, particularly amazingly in the Arab world, now see Israel as the essential bulwark against Islamic fundamentalism, Islamic extremism. It's becoming more and more essential. So all these things are going on simultaneously, presenting what apparently is a very complex and a very paradoxical picture.
Students like what you have to say. I think that one of the key questions that's been, or key themes that's coming up, is the question of whether or not anti-Israel activity is anti-Semitic activity. Do you guys have any thoughts on whether anti-Israel is a new form of anti-Semitism?
I think it's clear that it is. It's politically correct anti-Semitism now. I'm kind of fascinated about these elections on what they say internally, which really hasn't been talked about so much here. You know, one of the things that we're trying to figure out in Israel is, what does a Jewish state mean? You know, and Melanie touched on why we're hated, but who are we? How are we defining ourselves? And I think some of what you're seeing in these elections are reflecting that, our kind of internal process on, after 70 years, figuring out what does it mean to be a Jewish state. So interestingly enough, and I think sadly, you didn't hear so much from, let's say, the ultra-Orthodox in this election. You know, they'll be probably part of whatever coalition there is, but it was fairly quiet when it came to what was going on within their migzarim, within their own, own areas. And I don't think that that's good. I would like to see them more part of the process here. But I think, for example, what's happened with Zehud in the elections is also interesting. As I read, a columnist wrote, he kind of cast himself as a pro-pot Steve Jobs, you know, like the turtleneck and all that. And I think that a lot of Israelis voted today not so much on security, because we're tired of always thinking about that. And we'd like to focus more on what's happening inside this country, the positive elements of what this country is, which we all know and are incredibly proud of, by the way. I mean, I travel to the States. I speak a lot in the States now. And it is a joy to represent this state in the rest of the world. It really is. I mean, this is a tremendous place, and we're doing so much for the rest of the world. I think we need to maybe stand up a little bit straighter and realize that also. the positive aspects of this country.
The issue that you raised, Eve, I'm being questioned all the time from American Jewry. I was just on TV there a few days ago, and they want to understand why aren't the religion and state issues stronger issues? Why is everyone only talking about the security issues? Why don't we hear more? And all the exit polling in Israel, all the exit polling data shows that when it's all said and done, security is number one, very high on the list. Economy is number two. We went an entire hour of the first hour of the show, didn't even talk about anything other than security. Economy is number two, and then religion and state is a far three. But it's there. It exists, where it hasn't been there in the past. In the last number of years, we're seeing more of a discussion about this. It could be why Moshe Feiglin and Zehut are being successful. But what's fascinating is when it's all said and done and a government has to be formed, it could be that very ultra-Orthodox bloc that determines exactly which way it goes. And that's going to be, after all the discussions and all the debates and all of the issues, they're going to come back and they're going to be the ones to determine this government. That's something which people who are watching all around the world have to recognize as well. All the internal Israeli politics, which ultimately determine what a government is in Israel.
We're just starting to get into what I think can become a very heated conversation and an interesting one on what it means to be a Jewish state and bringing together all the various elements. However, we are going to skip ahead now and we'll return to JNS's correspondent Josh Hasten, who is live at the Likud headquarters. Josh, welcome to the program, and tell us what the mood is like at the Likud headquarters in Tel Aviv tonight.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me. Thanks so much.
Josh, I want to know what the mood is like in Tel Aviv at the Likud headquarters.
So, as a result of the situation, whether it's real or not, in terms of the low turnout, the event here is supposed to start at 8 p.m., was off to 11 p.m. That being said, I just had the opportunity to speak to MK Omir Ohana, Likud MK Ohana, for a couple minutes here, and he said that while 2 hours ago it looked like the low voter turnout would have a negative effect on Likud, he has picked up the last several hours, and he's optimistic at this point. But he then said, let's talk again in an hour and see where things...
Josh, are you getting any other insights? I mean, do people... Well, it looks like we have a little bit of a spotty connection, so we'll come back to you a little bit later in the program when hopefully we'll find out, a little bit more from the exit polls, and we'll get a better sense of the mood.
Just all this talk, by the way, about the lower percentage. I mean, just to be fair, at 8 p.m. it was 61.3%, which is just 1% less than 2015. That's not majorly significant and not a major shift. It is significantly lower in the Arab population, that is for sure. Many different reasons given for an analysis for that, which, by the way, I know I'm jumping here for a moment, but when you talk about election results, the current Knesset has an joint Arab list of 15 seats, which is a significant number. You might have a situation, Alex, where at the end of tonight, at the end of all the counting, there's now 2 Arab parties that are running. One might not cross the threshold, and the other one might get 6 or 7. That's a massive shift just in terms of the Knesset itself. In terms of, we're not even talking about who's prime minister or not, just in terms of the Arab representation.
Right, we have two Arab parties vying to be in the Knesset. In the previous election, they had united into a single party. This time they've divided. And the Arab parties, while entering the Knesset, have historically never entered into an Israeli government. They've never entered into a governing coalition. As we talk about the blocks between the right bloc and the left bloc, in almost all the calculations, when people talk about the left bloc, they're also including the Arab parties within that bloc, even though the Arabs have historically never entered into a government and have pledged not to enter a government. And also, both the Likud and the Blue and White have stated that they have no intention of sitting together with the Arabs. So maybe we could talk a little bit about this dynamic of, I think it brings us back to the discussion that Eve was talking about, that you have these sectors in Israeli society. You have the ultra-religious sector. You have the Arab sector. You have the sector of settlers, the sort of Dati Leumi, as they're called in Israel, these different sectors. And then you also have the far left, and then you have the centrists. You have, how does this all work? How does this all come together? I mean, it's very Jewish, isn't it?
certainly not very British. I mean, I think was it Ben Gurion who said he had two great regrets. Perhaps he had more than two, but anyway, what I read, he had two great regrets. Looking back, great mistakes that he made. One was to exempt the Haredim from military service, and the other was not to adopt the British parliamentary system of first past the post, because the British system does not. I mean, this is like sort of so peculiar to me that there's all this haggling, that you don't have here the direct connection between the representative and the people representing a constituency, but it's all party lists, and then it's all backroom deals and haggling. So that all kinds of little parties who represent so few people can hold the balance of power and can dictate the strategy and the policies of the country. Now, I understand that, from the point of view of a kind of ideal of democracy, it's a very good thing because everybody has a say. But on the other hand, you can't then run a country like a kind of market bazaar. But of course, you do.
That's, by the way, you're correct.
I just want, before you get in, the audience, you guys have been totally engaged and also very patient, and we're just about to open the floor to questions. I feel like there's a lot of questions bubbling. So raise your hands if you want to ask a question. Steve's going to come around. Meanwhile, I pass the mic to Do.
There is a growing consensus that I'm seeing in terms of the issue which Melanie raised, which is people feeling I'm not really voting for my representative. And the more Israelis learn about how it works around the world, the more they feel like they've been robbed of that opportunity to have someone in the Knesset representing them, someone who's beholden to them, someone who has accountability. That's a word which is very much lacking in the Israeli electorate. So it will be interesting to see if over the next few years any kind of a movement can be made. I can tell you that as a member of the 19th Knesset, I tried very hard to build a coalition, a consensus in the Knesset. It was very difficult to do so. People are very much, they're going with the status quo, and they're not looking for any kind of a shakeup. Ben Gurion in 1969 was so furious over this that he wouldn't even join together with the forming Ma'arach of the Labor and the Rafi. So it is something which Israel definitely needs to shift to. It'll be healthier for the country.
Well, I have to tell you, given what's going on in Britain at the moment, you may have heard of Brexit. What's going on in Britain makes this country, for the first time ever, look like a beacon of sanity.
So I want to add to that, as someone who's in the States fairly often, that I have to pat us on the back as well. You can have this discussion in this country. You can actually walk up on the street and ask somebody who they're voting for, and they may disagree with you, but you can have the conversation, a conversation that you now cannot have in the United States. It is so polarized. So I think that we're a beacon of sanity in other ways as well. A lot of insanity, but there are certain things that we're actually doing better than other countries at this point. Not that that's like the bar is being set really low, but still it is something to in a country that we're constantly criticizing ourselves. I think sometimes we have to look around and realize that the world is a crazy place. We fit in with everybody, but we're definitely not at the bottom of the heap.
Well, I think one of the things that I think one of the things that Israel has as an advantage in the current political climate around the world is that we've had a polarized political climate since the beginning, right? And we're Jewish, so even on Jewish law, we just have tractates and tractates of arguments over things that we agree upon, right? So in a sense, you'll have members of different families that one member of the family will vote to the far right, while another will vote to the far left, and you'll have like Friday night dinners or holiday dinners where people will come together. They will shout until they're red in the face about Israeli politics. But then at a certain point, they'll change the subject and they'll talk about their kids or they'll talk about something else. And at the end of the night, they're just going to enjoy the food and they're going to hug and kiss on the way out the door. And it's something that I think that the Israeli political climate has a lot to teach, especially in the United States now, where you see progressives and Trump lovers disavowing long-held relationships and also Remain advocates and Brexit advocates, disavowing friendships. So I think there's something very healthy a little bit about the way we're able to have our politics and have our cake and eat it too.
One of the greatest lessons that I learned in the Knesset was you can literally have two members of Knesset at each other's throats in session, yelling, screaming, things that we're not familiar with, certainly from the American culture in terms of or at least an effort for a unity government with real discussions, because everyone's able to put that aside ultimately, recognizing that we ultimately only have each other, so we have to find a way to make this work.
Yeah. I think it's very important also here that we pause and recognize in this room that we're doing something very special. At the same time when the Israeli populace is doing something very special, this is a true celebration of Israeli democracy at play, and we're taking the opportunity now to explain that to the diaspora. And there's been a lot of discussions and disagreements with Jews around the world that really don't understand why Israelis think the way they do and why Israeli politicians decide the way they do. I'm going to open it up to a conversation and also to questions from the audience. But first, our roving reporter Steve Leibowitz did go out in the days before the election taking the pulse of the Israeli public right here in Jerusalem on Emek Rephaim Street, and he asked a number of people about the importance of diaspora relations and the importance of Israel maintaining strong relations, especially with the American Jewish community.
What about the issue of Israeli diaspora relations? Are things going about as you would like, or is there an important need for improvement?
Of course. We have to look at them as part of our nation. And, for instance, the whole thing with giyur kehalacha,
conversion according to Jewish law,
is not acceptable. Neither is marriage. And I like to see them as part of us.
Do you think that things are going well, or is there a need for improvement?
There's a need for improvement.
In what ways, sir?
To create some sort of unity, to speak to each other, not yell at each other.
Okay.
To be more inclusive.
I think one of the problems, as I read it, is American Jewry has developed a Judaism and a sense of its identity which no longer includes Israel as the homeland for our people. And this is a function of many factors. But I think at the end of the day, it represents a misreading and a miscalibration. And the Judaism that they profess is one which needs input from this particular place.
Are you concerned about relations between Jews in the diaspora and the government in Israel?
Absolutely.
Why?
In the last 5 years, because we should work together. We should recognize Reform people and the others, all Jewish people in the States, Europe, all around the world. We should stick together.
I think it is a problem. I think that Bibi doesn't count them. He wants their money, but he doesn't count on them. You know, you understand? It's.
Yes, I think the reform and conservative movements are shying away. They're shying away too much. They're not comfortable with what goes on.
So something has to be done to bring them back?
In that realm, yes. Or something has to be done where they have to recognize this is the situation here in Israel, and they have to work and mainstream it, that this is how it's done in Israel and not done in a diaspora setting.
Are you concerned about relations between Jews of the diaspora and Jews in Israel?
Very much so, very much so. And indeed, this is a big issue. The present government did not do a good job in here at all. And this is one big thing that if it wants to survive, it has to make a big change here.
So the countdown is on. Only a very short time until we will get the first results from the exit poll of the elections. And it looks like it could still go either way as the anticipation mounts.
Well, we are going to, as promised, open the floor to questions. First of all, big round of applause again to all our college students here in the audience. Let's take questions from the floor. We have a question here. And just say your name and say where you're from and what university you're attending.
Well, my name is Jonah Carroll. I'm from Chicago. I studied at George Washington University. This question is also related to diaspora affairs. And I was interested in how much credit do Israeli voters put into the special relationship that Netanyahu and Trump have? How much of that is a credit to him? And do Israelis see Netanyahu as kind of an indispensable leader because of his relationship with Trump?
We haven't seen polling numbers or primary research on how the public perceives the value and the quality of the Trump-Netanyahu relationship. But I think that there are two major consensus issues in Israel that are long-standing consensus issues, and that is the consensus on the Golan Heights, the consensus on Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and the fact that the President of the United States, for the first time in modern history, recognized those two major consensus issues, it's very reasonable to state that Trump overall is well regarded in Israel, and that's of course staying out of the American political scene and the domestic political scene altogether. But I mean, what this President of the United States has done for Israel, no president in modern history has done for Israel, and it's reflected in a generally positive view of the President and Israel, and a generally positive view of the relationship. Let's just remember that we've heard a lot of comments on the panel this evening, sort of in a sense amortizing or depreciating the notion that Netanyahu was lucky that Trump's in the White House. Let's remember, President Trump is a very specific political personality, and it requires another type of personality in order to engage, embrace, cooperate, and maximize that relationship. I think the Prime Minister Netanyahu, has done that exceptionally well, as he has as well with President Putin. So I think it goes to his credit, and I think that both sets of relationships are very well admired by the majority of the Israeli public.
And certainly, the Prime Minister is trying to demonstrate that his relationship with Trump is one of the things that Israelis should vote for or consider when they're voting. Let's go back to the floor. I think there's a question here.
Hi.
In the middle.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Rachel Moore. I live in Neve Daniel in Judea. And I'd like the panelists to weigh in on Prime Minister Netanyahu's relatively last-minute statement about the annexation of Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria. His decision to make that statement, if you think it's an indicator of his reluctance to go into a unity coalition that you've been talking about, and whether we should expect realistically to see anything come of it after the elections.
I'm going to say something which I don't want in any way to take away from the respect that the young students here have for our leaders in Israel. But I wouldn't take anything that has been said about any policy over the last week as indicative of anything other than people wanting to get elected. That's a strategy which you see throughout the last number of years. The Prime Minister even began to walk it back already during interviews where he said, I don't really mean to annex the West Bank. I just mean to put Israeli law on the Jewish communities there. This is very much the way I see it, an attempt to try to get voters. And I don't think the Prime Minister would hesitate to bring in Benny Gantz into a unity government if he felt that was the best way to secure his continuing to lead the country.
It's a very important question that you ask, because if anybody in this room could have imagined that any statesman or stateswoman, politician in Israel would have mentioned annexation as a mainstream idea, even 5 years ago, you would have laughed that person out of the room. And as your question suggests, annexation is being discussed, whether it's political posturing or not. It's actually on the table. And the fact that it's on the table, even on a declarative level, is unprecedented in the political discussion in Israel. And it's a reflection, I think, of what Professor Inbar said, of the real implosion of what we have known to be the Oslo political and diplomatic process for the last 25 years.
Now, if I might, I think that I want to pivot a little bit back towards diaspora relations, which is the topic of this panel, and the idea of annexing settlements to the Jewish community abroad. They would think, what happened, right? We were just at the AIPAC conference a few weeks ago, and the American Jewish community in particular recognizes a two-state solution as the appropriate solution to the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. And all of a sudden to hear a prime minister that's sort of losing touch with many American Jewish leaders all of a sudden saying, I'm going to annex settlements, whether or not he actually does that after the formation of the elections, is he right to be saying that? And should he be taking into account the views of diaspora Jews when he's going to the polls before an Israeli electorate?
So the irony is that in a Jewish country, There were a whole lot of Hail Marys being thrown this week from all these different political parties, and it's true that we have to take everything with major grains of salt. But one of the things that I do when I go to the States and speak is try and explain to diaspora Jewry that we're in the Middle East here in Israel. And I just want to call out somebody in the audience who is probably the expert on this, Harold Rode, who has spoken about this and written about this extensively. The culture of the Middle East is not the culture of the West. And one of the fascinating things about Israel is that we are really a mix of East and West in a way that I don't think any other country is. You know, Israel, someone mentioned about Israel, you mentioned about why people hate Israel. We're like this, the rich white people. Israel's not a white country. And half of the Jews that live in Israel are Middle Eastern Jews. And that culture, if you want to call it Arab culture, whatever you want to call it, but the culture of the Middle East, which is very different than the Christian culture that's really prevalent, whatever religion you are, outside Israel, is very much a part of who we are in this country. Be it honor, be it respect, be it also, and I also live in Gush Etzion, wanting to actually live in a country, finally, and have, forget even the ideology, and I don't know if Netanyahu is going to go after this, but I think this is part of where the country is going, not even necessarily on the ideology of greater land of Israel, but on a normal day-to-day level, on having the environmental issues be better, the roads be safer. 99% of our days are not spent thinking about ideology, but incidentally, both the Arabs and the Jews would benefit from that. And so that is one of the major pushes that we have here, as opposed to maybe in the past where it was more of an ideological look, is that life would be better for everybody living in these areas where Israeli law applied. And so this is a little bit different than what we've had in the past, and I think incredibly important.
I think Eve is entirely right that the Middle East culture is quite different from the West, which insists on part of the West. But having said that, Israel has behaved for decades in thrall to that mistaken Western belief about Israel. Israel has, I think Israel is culpable in this regard, and so are the Jewish diaspora communities, in that they have allowed between them, for various reasons, what is basically an existential war against Israel, against the Jewish state by the Arab side, to have been reconfigured entirely falsely as a conflict between two peoples with legitimate claims to the land over the division of the land. And if you reframe it in that context, as it has been reframed, if you're somebody living in, say, Britain, with the best will in the world, you don't harbour any nasty feelings about Jews, but you don't know anything about the Middle East, about Jewish history, about Israel's history, about pre-Israel history, you believe that this is a conflict over land boundaries. And therefore, you're very, very receptive to the idea that if Israel kind of unilaterally says, we're going to grab some of this land, then, of course, Israel is seen as the aggressor, because the entire framing is wrong. Britain, and in fact many, many Jews in the Jewish community in Britain, and I think in the United States as well, they have absolutely no idea that where Israel's coming from is not simply defending its population against attack. Israel is standing on the grounds of international law, on the moral right to the land. Leave aside whether it's prudent or desirable for it to hold on to all that land. That's not the issue. The issue in the minds of the people in the diaspora or the Western world who think that Israel is terrible because it behaves illegally all the time, and as a matter of sort of its foundation, it's here illegally. They have to be told that Israel stands for law, and that it's these other countries, going back to Britain in the early part of the last century, which tore up international law, as a result of which there is this conflict, which is an existential conflict. Now, unless that is reframed, people very understandably will look at what Netanyahu has said in the context of this election and say, look at what they're going to do now, because it's out of context. And it always amazes me that Israel just meekly, as it were, goes along with this false narrative, I think on the basis that, we have better things to do with our time than try and educate the rest of the world. We have to live from week to week. And so it's all kind of pragmatism and, let's not think about the big picture. And as a result, that's why the Hasbara battle has been so comprehensively lost.
Let's take one other question from the floor.
Just to get back to the church and state issue being such a low issue are now. I'd like to know have a thought on the fact that we sorted these issues out 70 years ago with the status quo. And yes, the Haredim in the army issue has become significantly bigger as a result of demographic changes, but we're going to have to learn to live with ourselves exactly the same way that they learned how to live with themselves 70 years ago. I'm not going to be forced to go into the army, and I'm not going to force anybody to keep Shabbos. That's just not going to happen. They've tried in 2013, the Yesh Lapid and Yesh Atid, they tried, and all it created was angst, aggression, pain on all sides, because they tried to move away from what was the agreed status quo of, we don't agree, but we'll live together and try to make things work. If any aggression on either side on this issue will just cause, eventually the tick will come back, as it's happened. All of Yesh Atid's revolution got completely undone was the second the Haredim got back into the government, and all it left was just a scar on the children, a scar on an entire generation of hatred on all sides. And can we just move forward from these issues and learn to live together and focus on just improving the general quality of life for all on all sides?
So that's a question which I'm asked very often as I travel around the world. We have to remember that in 1950, the status quo was for 400 young men to be the elite scholars who are going to be focusing on studying Torah as their service to the Jewish people. Today, that quote-unquote status quo is 55,000 people who are not serving. So you can say status quo as much as you want, but that's not status quo, because 400 is not 55,000. Israel as a whole... Israel as a whole recognizes that there has to be some kind of a change when it comes to this. Let's remember, it's the Supreme Court that's requiring legislation. It's not some person sitting back and deciding, I want to make a change. And we will come to that balance. There's a process that's taking place. There are more ultra-Orthodox serving in the army than ever before, more officers than ever before, more working than ever before, more in higher education than ever before. And as that happens, we're having a more moderate Israeli electorate, and we'll find some kind of a balance between all these religion and state issues. So that's the claim of status quo we can't apply when there's changes happening in society itself. And I think that as time goes along, we're going to see Israel working out all of these issues in a way which makes all sides not 100% happy, but 80% happy. And that's the goal that we have to be shooting for.
We're actually going to go to the phones right now. We have Yaakov Lapin, JNS military correspondent, doing double duty tonight at the Blue and White headquarters. Yaakov, welcome to the program. Say hi to the audience and tell us what the mood is like in Tel Aviv at the Blue and White headquarters. Yaakov, what's the mood like?
Trouble here because of the connection.
We want to know, tell us what's going on.
Here is one of a close battle.
Well, that's the mood.
Yeah. Where the brink of a potentially historic evening, and feel that things...
Sounds like we've lost Yaakov, unfortunately. I do really want to get a sense for what's going on in the field, but what we'll do now is we'll pivot towards our next panel. We have two incredible panelists with us now. First, the Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem, Fleur Hassan Nahum, who holds the unique portfolio for foreign affairs within the city. You've been a longtime council member and a friend, and also Itamar Marcus, who is the founder and director of Palestinian Media Watch. We've really seen all eyes focus on Jerusalem this past year with the recognition of Jerusalem and Israeli sovereignty over the Holy City, and also the moving of the American embassy officially to Jerusalem. So Jerusalem's had a pretty good year.
We've had a great year.
And it's only going to get better from here. I'm very optimistic. When I was in APAC a couple of weeks ago, I met with the president of Honduras. Honduras also announced that they're moving their embassy. Guatemala's already here. There's another couple of small South American, Central American countries coming. You know, this is what people keep asking me. Do you think this is something that's going to impede peace? And I say, look, first, every sovereign country has a right to say where their capital is. And this is our capital city, always has been, always will be, and that's something that there's no argument about. So to recognize an economic reality, a real reality, diplomatic reality, is about time coming. The United States obviously was the anchor for this. There's going to be a domino effect. And I see it from a practical level as somebody in the Jerusalem City Council as a way to provide economic opportunities for the city, to make the city even more cosmopolitan than it is. And I'm getting very positive feedback from almost everybody involved. They claim doom and gloom. Wow, my God, what's going to happen when they move the embassy, security situation? Nothing happened. And the Americans, with our help, are now planning to open and to build a brand new, beautiful embassy. And that can only be good for the city and good for the country. So we're very excited.
Now, anybody that spends any time in Jerusalem sees the number of cranes that are hovering over the city at any moment. You could literally count 100 different building projects that are taking place. New buildings going up, old buildings being refurbished, the total refurbishment of the entrance of the city with 25 new towers, the fast train from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem about to be extended all the way to Tel Aviv, and also the fact that in just a few years' time, all of the federal government ministries are going to be moving to the city, which is going to bring, as you mentioned, countless jobs, not just the specific government jobs to the city, but also all the ancillary jobs that need to support government. Is this an exciting time to be on the city council of Jerusalem? I mean,
exciting is a good word for the Jerusalem City Council. Sometimes it feels a bit of a jungle or a zoo, depends what day. But look, in general, it's actually a very exciting time. In 10 years, Jerusalem will look very, very different to what it looks like today. Unfortunately, with all the cranes and everything that we see, we're still not building fast enough to ensure that the young people can afford to buy in this city. And this is our biggest challenge. People have to be able to afford to buy in this city. And this is something that we're working on all the time, and it's not actually simple, because you can't build here because of the Green Line and because we don't want to cause an incident with America. Until now, we still haven't been able to build in Givat HaMatos because of upsetting the American government or the status quo when it comes to building. So these are things that maybe another Trump the second Trump term, will allow us the opportunity to be able to build so that this city can build and young people can stay here and it can continue to grow.
Now, one of the interesting things about the city is that we always talk about the importance of keeping the city united. However, anybody that really understands the geography of the city recognizes that you might not be able to draw a straight line, but you probably can draw a line that separates the western, primarily Jewish section of the city from the Arab section of the city. And you have about 250,000 plus Arabs living on the eastern section of the city. You have probably about 350 to 400,000 Jews and others living in the western side of the city. And there really are questions about whether the city functions as a united city. And certainly that's going to be one of the issues that comes up in the highly anticipated Trump deal of the century. And I want to turn to Itamar, because we've heard rumors that when we talk about embassies moving to Jerusalem, that there could in the future be a Palestinian embassy in the eastern sections of Jerusalem. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Palestinian Authority, how important Jerusalem is to them, and I think the wider question of, do we really have a partner for peace on the other side in the Palestinian Authority?
Okay, so a couple of things. First, I just want to get back to what you started with when you talked about the dividing up the city. Where would you draw the line to create an Arab side and a Jewish side? One of the fascinating things is that the Palestinian Authority has put Jerusalem as the most important issue. But polls have shown that the Palestinian population, the Arab population of East Jerusalem, when asked which side of the border would they like to be on, if there were a peace treaty and Jerusalem was divided up. A strong majority, I think it was close to 65% said they wanted to be on the Israeli side. Then they were asked another question, if your side was on the Palestinian side, would you move to another place within Israel? And again, another 65% said they would move. So what's happening here is you've got a Palestinian Authority which is putting this as the most important issue of negotiations. There are no negotiations, but of a peace process, that they have to have half of Jerusalem. But the people themselves who know the Palestinian Authority, they know what it's like to live under the PA, they know what it's like to live under Israel, they'd much rather live under Israel. So the first thing is, again, PA was important, but the people themselves would rather be a part of Israel. The second question you asked about, is there really a peace process? Now, there really has never been a peace process from the Palestinian side. Israel has always hoped that this was a peace process. The Palestinian Authority, since the very beginning, has been telling their people that this is a stages process, meaning get as much as we can in small increments and continue to harass Israelis through terrorist or war. And I'll just give you one incredibly important quote by a person named Abbas Zaki, who's a senior Palestinian Authority figure, member of Central Committee of Fatah. Abbas Zaki was being interviewed on television, and he said, we all want, including Abbas, we all want the greater Palestine, meaning all of Israel. He says, but we can't say this publicly. And then he added something important. Everybody knows Israel can't survive the 67 borders. So we say we want the 67 borders. Israel can survive the 67 borders, and this is the tactic. This is a senior Palestinian Authority figure. So this has been their message to their people all along. So you say, is there a peace process? Can we go back to the peace process? There never was a peace process from the perspective of the Palestinian Authority. There was a war of attrition process against Israel. There was a stages process. And tragically, Israel has been giving into this. We have withdrawn. And every time we withdrew, we had more casualties. And then we gave them Gaza. Every time we did this, we got more death. And everybody thinks that Oslo was derailed. Oslo was never derailed. This was exactly the Palestinian Authority plan from the start.
That you bring up the polling data about Palestinians living in Jerusalem, wanting to remain under Israeli sovereignty in Jerusalem. Many times Palestinians argue that Israel doesn't care as much about the Palestinian residents, that the amount of infrastructure that's built in the western portion of the city is not as strong as the infrastructure that's built in the eastern sections of the city, including schools, including parks, that the paving of roads is difficult, that it's hard to get permits for building. Maybe you can relate a little bit to how a primarily Jewish government deals with such a large Arab population in the eastern sections of the city.
First of all, just to give everybody a picture of what we're talking about in terms of proportion. Arabs in East Jerusalem are 38% of the Jerusalem population. The ultra-Orthodox population is 30%, and then the rest of the third is the rest of us, which is everything between completely secular to modern religious or Zionist religious or whatever it is. And you know what? The Arabs are right. For many, many years, Jerusalem municipality did not do anything in the eastern part of the city. You know, I'm one of these people who want, happy to put a mirror in front of my face and say the things that we've done right, but the things that we've done wrong. We have not invested in East Jerusalem like we should have, for many reasons. And we're not talking about something of left or right. Teddy Kollek was the mayor for many, many years. He was a Labour Party mayor, and there was very, very little investment. What happens, and this is something that I always talk about, we're all living in the same boat, and if the boat has a hole on one side, the ship is going down. This city cannot afford to keep the Arabs disenfranchised from the city, and it cannot afford, you asked earlier about the line. There is a line. There is a line that separates West and East Jerusalem, and just look at the infrastructure, just look at the roads. But what I'm very happy to say is that in the last year, there was a historic government decision pioneered by Minister Zev Elkin from the Likud party, which is bringing an unprecedented amount of investment into East Jerusalem, 2.2 billion shekels. And that money is going to go into infrastructure that is very much needed. And this is actually in the agenda of keeping the city united. Because if the city looks like two cities, it's much easier to divide it. If the city looks like one city, it'll be a much harder thing to divide. And so what we need to do is try and bring the eastern part of the city up in terms of infrastructure, in terms of employment, and in terms of education. Most people don't know that in East Jerusalem, there's 3 types of education for children there. There's the Palestinian Authority education, which is completely bankrupt because it doesn't teach the children Hebrew and it doesn't teach the children English. So, what they're going to do when they graduate is actually unbelievably, there's not much hope there. They're good for stacking shelves in a supermarket and that's it. And then you have the Christian school system, which is mainly private. And then you have Iriyat Yerushalayim schools, Jerusalem municipality schools that teach the Arab curriculum from the Ministry of Education. And what we're trying to do now is take more of the Palestinian Authority schools to apply the Israeli curriculum. Now, this curriculum is not teaching them to be Zionists, but it's taking out incitement, and it's also teaching them English and Hebrew and computer studies so that when they graduate, they have the hope of better jobs. And when you have economic development, you have a happier population. When you have economic development, you are building the infrastructure for coexistence. And this is something that we can't take lightly. We need to be more invested in East Jerusalem for two reasons. One, so the city remains one. And the second, because it's good for the entire city. We cannot afford to be carrying part of the city which lives 50% under the poverty line. And by the way, it's the same with the Haredim. We cannot afford to be pulling up a population whose men only work 50% of the workforce. Somebody asked earlier about the status quo. At the end of the day, I'm actually a big fan of the status quo. I live in Jerusalem and we have battles all the time. But if the Israeli economy cannot sustain 50% of Haredi men not working, we cannot sustain 50% of Haredi men not working. It's not even an issue of the army. It's an issue of what the economy can sustain. And in 20 years' time, the Haredim will be a third of the population of Israel. We cannot sustain an economy where 50% of the male workforce is not working.
Well, I think you're raising I think that you're raising so many key points, really, that the government of Israel, whether it's on the city and municipal level or on the federal level, really has to balance so many unique issues at the same time. And I think that people that are abroad sometimes take for granted the amount of complex, super complex issues that the Israeli government needs to consider, all while trying to maintain governing coalitions, which is extremely hard to do. Our roving reporter, Steve Leibowitz, went out onto the street and asked people what are the issues that they thought are the most important. We're already at 10? I thought we were 2 minutes of 10. We're at 10. Okay, we're going to go straight to the polls. It's really the moment. I want to thank our panelists, Flora and Itamar, for being with us. And, you see the countdown is here. The time that we're waiting for.
Just to point out, apparently all three stations are different in terms of what they have.
And we'll explain what the results are in a few minutes.
על פי מדגם כאן חדשות וחברת קנטר קרב ראש בראש צמוד בין נתניהו וגנץ. כחול לבן מובילים עם 37 מנדטים, הליכוד צמוד מאוד עם 36 מנדטים. זה הולך להיות לילה ארוך. ממשיכים. מפלגת העבודה עם 8 מנדטים היא המפלגה השלישית בגודלה. ש"ס עם 7 מנדטים, גם יהדות התורה עם 7 מנדטים. מפלגת חד"ש-תע"ל בראשות איימן עודה ואחמד טיבי עם 6 מושבים, והיא כרגע המפלגה הערבית היחידה בכנסת. נמשיך. 5 מנדטים למרץ, כולנו בראשות משה כחלון עם 5 מנדטים, איחוד מפלגות הימין גם כן 5. ישראל ביתנו של אביגדור ליברמן עם 4 מנדטים. לא עוברות כרגע. הימין החדש בראשות נפתלי בנט ואיילת שקד מאוד קרובה לאחוז החסימה. זהות של משה פייגלין, גשר של אורי לוי וגם בל"ד. תמונת הגושים היא המעניינת. גוש הימין 64 מנדטים. גוש השמאל והערבים 56 מנדטים, וכך זה נראה במטות של המפלגות.
Okay, so
ליכוד מול כחול לבן. ירון דקל, אנחנו איתך. אם אפשר...
Okay, so first of all, this is exciting. That these are just exit polls, and we're going to talk about that in a second, what the polls mean. But just to announce to everybody what we have seen so far, the exit polls show that Blue and White Benny Gantz is leading with 37, which is much higher than he was polling. The Likud a close second with 36, Labor with 8, Shas and UTJ, the two religious parties, with 7 apiece. The Arab Party Hadash with 6. The other Arab party, Ram Balad, did not make the threshold. Yisrael Beitenu with Avigdor Lieberman gets 4. The United Right got 5, which is the mostly settler party. Kulanu with 5. That's the party of Moshe Kachlon, the foreign minister, and Meretz, the far-left party, with 5. We did not see in the results whether the New Right party of Naftali Bennett and Ayelet Shaked crossed the threshold, as well as the party that was polling well before the election, the Zehut party of Moshe Feiglin. So there's a few surprises, I think, in the elections. Number one, that a few parties polling above the threshold may not have gotten in, and the two main parties both scored results that appear to be much higher than what they were polling.
So just to clarify, in the poll that we saw, and there's another one there's many different ones that are out there, Zehut of Moshe Feiglin did not get in. United Right of Naftali Bennett did not get in. That was, by the way, in one station. Another station, which has Blue and White at 37 to 33, also has Zehut of Feiglin and Bennett out. So that seems to be a trend that seems to be across the board. But you do see a few different results based on the stations that are out there. But again, the two big stories in terms of the smaller parties are the decline of Zehut of Moshe Feiglin and United Right, and the fact that, according to no station, is there a complete and total knockout of Blue and White. The greatest the greatest gap that we see is on Channel 12, which has Blue and White at 37 and Likud at 33. So again, a lot of time that we're going to have to explain how the exit polls work as well to all of our viewers. But at the moment, those are the two major stories: Moshe Feiglin and Bennett possibly not getting in, and no major knockout on any station from Blue and White against Likud.
Oh, do we have them? We have Blue and White on the phone. Yaakov Lapin, are you with us?
1 more minute.
Okay, we need 1 more minute. I think that it's one of the things that we talked about early on was the question of whether or not the voters would vote with their ideological preferences and want to go for the smaller parties, or would they want to consolidate the chances of their candidate for the prime minister. And we see really that, at least in the Channel 1 results, that the electorate has turned towards the two main candidates for prime minister. Benjamin Netanyahu received 36 mandates, one below, Blue and White 37. It seems like in some ways we might have a similar situation to the 2009 elections, when Benjamin Netanyahu finished 1 seat behind Tzipi Livni at that time, who was running the Zionist Union. And we're still trying to do the math right here. How big are the blocks? It looks like, by my count, the left block only gets about 50 votes. But we still have to see, really, we have to figure out who made it, who didn't make it. And Dov, maybe you can explain a little bit about what exit polls mean and what we're going to find out in the coming hours and in the coming days.
So this is perhaps the most important question at the moment, as I'm seeing just the reaction in this room. I'm seeing the reaction on social media. The exit polls are polls that have been done throughout the day. There's a science to it, but you have to remember, it ends at about 8 p.m. We're at 10 p.m. now with the results, but the last 2 hours are not necessarily taken into account. So even though, for example, we have one station with Blue and White ahead by 4, one station Blue and White ahead by 1, one station they're in a tie, 36-36 according to Channel 13, a few hours from now, as every single ballot box, every single place across the country begins to count the votes by hand, and you're going to start seeing the results coming in, you could see a significant shift in any possible direction. So, for example, we've been seeing reports of, just like last time, a massive Likud change in the last 2 hours. That could drastically alter all of this. So at the moment, what we're seeing are certainly trends. We're certainly getting a sense for how the day went, but these are not by any means final results. The fact that there are two significant parties, both Zehut of Moshe Feiglin and New Right of Naftali Bennett, that may or may not get in. That's 4 seats from each one of those that either get in or don't get in. We have a long night ahead of us and possibly a very late morning ahead of us, as we see. So take everything that we're seeing right now with a grain of salt. Understand their initial results, but they certainly indicate trends, that's for sure.
And I'm also seeing that in the Channel 1 poll, we saw that Ram Balad did not make the threshold, and I'm seeing another report here that they have 5 seats. So you can really see the difference there, shifting 2 seats one way or another. It could actually be a 5-seat jump, and we can really change the dynamic and also the way votes are distributed, right? I mean, that's very important to understand that you have 100% of votes and 120 seats. And you have a threshold of 3.25%, where if you fall below it, you don't get in, and that causes a redistribution. So really, few parties getting in, a few parties getting out can change the entire makeup of the government. So.
Absolutely, but the one headline at the moment is certainly no one seems to see a complete knockout from Blue and White to Likud. Again, could that change? It's possible. The likelihood of the last 2 hours seeing a rise from Blue and White is unlikely. The chance of there being some kind of a Likud rise from the last 2 hours is much more possible. But again, we have to wait and see how the next few hours play out.
I think in general, the fact that it's tight, I think was always predicted that it was going to be a tight race. I think what Dov says is right. The fact that both parties are getting so many seats, I think that's actually a good thing. It's a good thing that the bigger parties are strengthened, because then we're less reliant on the little parties to be the kingmakers, which actually I always say we have such a democratic system that it almost doesn't work. And so I think that it's a good move towards democracy, that the bigger parties in general are strengthened. And I'm kind of shocked that Lieberman is actually getting through the threshold, because he was counted as dead a couple of weeks ago. So that's kind of surprising. And like Dov says, I've been on the other end of elections where things looked very different in the polls, and then to the last minute, you didn't know who was going to win. Like the mayoral elections, the last mayoral elections, which, every voted. In the end, it was decided on 3,000 votes. It's obviously not the same. But the fact that it's tight, I think it's good news for Netanyahu, if you ask me.
Well, the different exit polls showing Channel 12 has Gantz apparently leading by as many as 4 seats.
That's the most out there.
And Channel 13 has it as a tie. Yeah. So that's definitely a big disparity. We're going to go now to the phones we have. We're going to hopefully a good connection with JNS military correspondent Yaakov Lapin in the headquarters of Blue and White. What are people feeling now that the exit polls have come out?
Good evening from Blue and White's election headquarters. As soon as the exit polls appeared on the big screen here behind me, there was a large roar and a cheer, and people here felt very happy with what they saw. I think that the first result showing that Benny Gantz has come out on top of Prime Minister Netanyahu has given people here a lot of cause for cheer. And of course, the bloc situation is more complex. Most of the exit polls are showing here a tie between the right and left blocs. That is also being perceived here as something that's positive, because up until now, the conventional wisdom was that the right-wing bloc would be larger, irrespective of what happens with Blue and White and Likud. And now we see that the political map might be changing. So people here are upbeat, and they're looking at this as a very positive result over here in Tel Aviv. Before the numbers came in, party sources were telling me that they had a feeling that this was a close battle, that this could be a historic evening, and that sensation seems to be dominating the election headquarters of Blue and White tonight. Back to you.
Thank you so much.
We try to make some order here. I don't understand what everybody's pulling out the champagne for Blue and White. I mean, it's real nice to see that you got 1 or 3, 3 more mandates, but the math is not working for Blue and White. The math is working for the Likud and the right wing. He's got 65. He has right now. If you take the Likud lose behind by 1 seat, it still has a 65. It has 65 seat coalition right now. So I mean, taking all the right wing parties, assuming that they're going to, with the Haredi parties, as they have said they would, recommend Prime Minister Netanyahu. If you look at the numbers, the numbers on Blue and White, you've got. You have 8 seats for the Labor Party, 5 seats for Meretz is 12. So right now you've got about 49 seats for Blue and White. So I'm not quite sure what they're talking about all the celebration going on.
For don't trust that anybody said before the election, we're not going to sit with this one and that one. That all disappears when the power comes through. So I wouldn't put my hand on fire for anybody not joining a Kahol Lavan government if Rivlin gives them the chance to actually create the government.
The only other point that has to be made, though, is this discussion of the left bloc. That terminology, I think, is very misleading because it's including the Arab parties in there, which in no way is any kind of I mean, again, the idea that Moshe Ya'alon, who is the candidate from the Likud that's in the blue and white, is going to go reach out to the Arab parties. There's a lot of misinformation when it talks about the blocs and that terminology. I think you have to remove the Arab parties from that equation for the moment. And in that case, as Dan says, in every single equation that I see here, Netanyahu would have a very clear path towards a very simple coalition that's very similar to the current one. And the one wild card that everyone was saying, we don't know what will happen, in the polls, I'm seeing 3 out of 3. 3 out of 3 of the major news networks, Feiglin and Zehut, does not get into the Knesset, and that's a blow to blue and white, and that's not something which is likely to change over the last 2 hours. They don't have the base to bring people out over the last 2 hours. That is a major story as well.
I also understand is that both those parties are hovering very, very near to the threshold, according to the results.
Which parties?
Both the New Right of Bennett and Shaked and the Zehut parties are polling very close to the threshold. So if either one of those parties gets in, that could be another 4 or potentially 8 seats for the right.
But that hurts the right-wing bloc, really. The fact that Naftali Bennett is hovering and the fact that Feiglin might not get in. I know Feiglin was a wild card and people thought he could go either way, but that's a lot of wasted votes for the right when you think about it.
It's true, but if you look at the numbers here, the Haredi parties now, according to exit polls, have received 50% more than any poll had shown, or most polls had shown them in the weeks leading up, and that's much better for the Likud. The Haredi parties I could not see any Haredi party sitting with Yair Lapid, according to the assessment of both sides. So that means that if you take Alex's point about the Arab parties, you have to subtract out the 6 that they have the real center left bloc, or you call it the Jewish Zionist bloc, you're really talking about 49-50 seats. Yeah. I mean, it's not.
It's always interesting. People don't really know how to poll Haredim. We saw it in the Jerusalem municipal election. They don't poll them well. We had Shas in the municipal election polling at 2 to 3 seats. They end up getting 5 seats. That's a lot. Nobody thought they would get it. They've got a good ground game, the Haredim. The rabbis tell them go out to vote for this one. They don't even know who they're voting for, but they just go and vote. They've got their parties. They're like soldiers of God. They go and they vote when they're needed, and they just go out there and do it. And nobody can poll this. It's incredible.
Lieberman also is the other party which doesn't show up very much in the polls. You have a lot of older Russians who are not necessarily answering phone calls or on the internet. And in every single poll over here, Lieberman has entered into, again, according to all of these polls, and that's unlikely to change as well from anything over the last 2 hours. The celebration that you see, there's going to be a lot of posturing right now for sure, and people want to generate a lot. And also, certainly, blue and whites can do anything they can to make it seem like we can form a coalition. That's going to be their message right now for sure, and we'll see if they're able to be successful in swaying anyone towards that side.
Well, we heard the excitement from the Blue and White Party headquarters. Now let's take the pulse of the Likud Party headquarters. Josh Haston is on the scene. Josh, what's the scene like at the Likud Party headquarters?
Thanks very much, Alex. So I hope you can hear me this time, by the way. They're here at the Likud headquarters. They're saying that this is a victory. I mean, everything is pretty close. If you saw the 3 different polls from 3 different TV stations, you had the Blue and White leading 37-36 in one of them. You had a tie in another, and then you had the Blue and White leading by a few seats in another. And people here are saying that it's still early, and they believe that the Likud is actually much closer. But then, as you guys were talking about before, in terms of the coalition building, it looks like at this point the right does have, Netanyahu will have the ability to build a coalition. One thing very interesting, one of the top Likud Central Committee members who was talking to the press before actually said that he would like the Likud to go into a coalition with Benny Gantz's Blue and White Party. As you know, throughout the election, Likud was saying that they would not do so. The Prime Minister was saying that he would not do so. But this, one of the top Central Committee members was adamant that he believed the best thing that Likud could do would be to bring in Gantz informal coalition with the Blue and White. So we'll see what happens. I mean, it's still pretty empty here. It's still young. The night is still young here. I know Blue and White, I saw it was packed over there. The Likud MKs are starting to come in now at this point, and we'll see where things stand at about an hour from so, when all of the Likud members, the top supporters, and the MKs come full force into the building. So we'll have to see what they say when there's more of a presence in the building. One Likud MK that I did see, he looked somewhat surprised, I'll tell you that. He looked a little bit disappointed. But overall, I think it's still a very positive attitude here, and everyone is saying the night is young, and it's very, very close, too close to call at this point.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Channel 12 poll right now, the one that shows Likud down by 4 seats, scoring only 33 seats versus Gantz's 37. And the poll shows that even in that scenario with Likud down by 4, that there's still the existing coalition reformation would cobble together the minimum of 60 mandates. So we'll see what happens. But in that poll, also interesting that both Arab parties, Hadash and Ram Balad, got in both with 6. So that's a big difference, whether it's going to be 12 or whether it's going to be 6, whether the Arab parties will have that many seats. And it looks like all polls show that Naftali Bennett and Ayelet Shaked are out, which really calls into question one of many moves that Naftali Bennett made, which may or not have been wise moves, including demanding the defense ministry from the Prime Minister when Avigdor Lieberman resigned his post, and then splitting off from the United Right to form his own party in the hopes that those two parties separate would gain more than they had before. And it turns that both Bennett and Shaked, who is a very popular minister, are looking like the odd men out.
Just one point, in the Channel 13 exit poll, they do get in, which does show your point, which is that even if they're not getting in, they're probably pretty close, and therefore, but again, those are not the typical parties where you see a last 2 hours of a significant rise, so I don't know what Bennett's situation is going to be, but it certainly plays a role in the coalition making. But either way, the final analysis that you just said, that even in the poll which shows Likud at its lowest, down to 33, they're still the ones that have a path towards a coalition, is something which we have to certainly keep our eyes on.
Danny, take the mic. We're joined now also by Danny Seaman, who's the director of the Israel Victory Project, also runs the opinion section at Midah magazine. Welcome to the program, Danny.
Thank you.
Former director of the government press office, so someone that's been covering elections for a long time, veteran in this. Welcome to the program.
I've been trying to evaluate. I think that Dov said things quite accurately. It's only just begun. We can't really say anything for this. We forget that there are always at least about 5 to 7 seats from the soldiers, from the military, that are not polled. And they tend to go to the right wing, so it may save Naftali Bennett. There's a good chance that they'll get it. Maybe Zehut. Who knows? Somebody jokingly here said on the on the feed on Facebook that Zehut's voters thought that the elections are tomorrow. So that's which makes a lot of sense.
Hey, they're going to have an after party either way, right?
You want to know that was Zimri. You can catch Zimri on Galei Israel every morning. He's very funny. But no, they were smoking something these past few months. The fact that they thought they were going to be in. But there are two things here. I think from Netanyahu, the reason Netanyahu was smiling is that he knows nobody has his. Nobody can grab him there. That's the best thing for him right now, because if anybody on the right wing causes problems, he goes to a national unity government with blue and white, and so he holds that against them. He will basically determine who he wants to have what. None of them are in a position to tell him what to do. Israel Beitenu may cause some problems because he needs them to get to. I don't see a stable government without them. He needs every one of the right-wing parties, definitely. But right now, he's in the best situation. He can definitely determine, especially if it's 1 or 2 seats. I believe the Likud will be above blue and white, at least by 1 seat, if not more than that. And basically, this is all played into Netanyahu's hands. He's the kingmaker. He'll be able to determine who has what seat in the government. And for him, I believe, if he's smart, this is his last 4 years, in which in 2 years he'll announce his retirement and give it a year for the Likud to determine who will be his replacement. And so within Likud, he's going to have his biggest problem right now within the Likud, because they all know whoever gets the better seat there or better position will be in a better position to claim the leadership of Likud after Netanyahu. But right now, from what you can see here, and these are definitely not the final results, that they never get them accurate. Just my initial thoughts is Netanyahu won this election, not by numbers, but by the fact that he's in control.
Just so everyone can know, first of all, the point about Bennett, they're saying it's 6,000 votes in most of the polls. So that's it? That's it. So the army coming in, et cetera, that's certainly a possibility. The other thing is that as we speak right now, Netanyahu is on the phone with Moshe Gafni, just securing, which we knew before, but just securing that. Once that is secured, then the possibility of Blue and White forming a coalition is very difficult. The only wild card I'll mention here is that I-24, and again, this seems so not like any other poll that we see. They do have a 33-27 Blue and White victory, which if that plays out in any way, that does make things a little bit more difficult in terms of the president turning to Likud. But otherwise, if we stay within the 4-1 to tie range, it's going to be towards Netanyahu.
Of course, but that means that if both parties have much less votes than like the 37-36 scenario, that means that other parties have received those votes. So you still have to do the math.
What's really interesting when we talk about what's happened to Feiglin, I've got to say, in the last 5 days, I've been bombarded with messages from Kulanu who seem to have changed tactic and started attacking Feiglin because they must have noticed, the pollsters must have told them that the votes that they were losing, and they were also on the edge, the votes that they were losing were going to Feiglin. So in the last 5-6 days, they blitzed everybody with negative campaigning on Feiglin, and it may have paid off.
He also, there was some damage done to himself as well by certain interviews that he did where people were definitely turned away a little bit.
Doing the foot fetish thing that ended up on Pornhub didn't help.
I'll allow Flora to describe it. But either way, there's no doubt that you saw a decrease because of that.
Oh, good. We have the polls actually running on the bottom of the feed right now, which is really nice. I think we should talk a little bit about, explain to the mostly international and American audience, what happens now? Okay, the results look something like what we see on the polls. Whatever the numbers are, a few up, a few down. What actually happens, and how does a government get created with all these numbers that somehow add up to 120?
The president of Israel, Reuven Rivlin, is going to call every party into his residence. It's an amazing process, which I was part of in 2015. You sit there, you sit with him. He talks a little bit about general results of the elections, and then at a certain point, he's going to turn to the party and say, who are you officially recommending to try to form a government? Some will say Netanyahu, some will say Gantz, some will say no one. We say we're not going to recognize anyone for prime minister. The president then has to analyze everything that he's been given. If he sees right in front of him someone who just based on those recommendations already has that magic number of 61, the president has the right to turn to someone else, but it's very unlikely in that scenario that he would turn to anyone else when there's someone who clearly had 61 when someone else is somewhere around 40 or in the low 40s. But then the president will then turn to the person who he's going to task with trying to form a government. There'll be an official ceremony where he's given that task, and then that candidate, in this case likely Netanyahu, will then begin the wheeling and dealing with every single party. What do they need to officially join his coalition? At a certain point, once that's accomplished, he has the 61, he goes to the president, he makes the presentation, and then a government is voted on officially within the...
That means also a little bit what they need in order to join the government. What could they need, and what could that include? What is that?
So there are different approaches here. Certainly, certain parties have ideologies. Let's talk about the ultra-Orthodox parties for a moment, who Netanyahu is talking to. They want to make sure that they have control over religious issues in the country. They want to make sure that whatever law is passed regarding their young Torah scholars having to serve in the army is something which is to their favor. And they'll ask the prime minister to commit to that. Now, Those commitments are formed in coalition agreements. They will also ask for various ministries. We want to be this minister, the head of this committee. We want to have this funding for this project. The Prime Minister, in this is where the impossible job of the Prime Minister really comes in. He has to put together 61 seats. And again, as we've seen, the highest number the Prime Minister, Likud has over here is 36, Blue and White is 37. They have to find close to 30 more seats amongst these parties that have 4 or 5 seats to join them. They are all squeeze the Prime Minister for ministry positions, for party chairmanships, and for their ideologies. And at some point, you'll have a coalition agreement which is brought together, and then you actually have a government which is formed. What will be interesting is, again, it doesn't seem like it, but we were talking about what happens if no one can do so. If no one's able to do so, do we go to new elections? How does that all play out? Again, it doesn't seem to be the scenario here. But then the government is voted on, and then you have a few years or whatever period of time this government lasts where everyone will continue to point back to the coalition agreement and say to the Prime Minister, you promised us this, that, and the other, and you're not keeping to it. And the Prime Minister has to constantly manage that to make sure that he always maintains a 61-seat majority. Because even after the government is formed, any party at any time, if they choose to, could say, we're going to leave your government, we're going to topple your government and bring the country to new elections. That's a little bit of a sense of what's going to happen over the next few weeks as people are watching the news coming from Israel.
There are other things that could happen. First off, there is a party called Blue and White that it's not really a party. There's no real ideology there. It's basically just not Bibi. That was good up until today. From now on, it's not Bibi. Now it's every one of us is in there for our own. There are a large group of people there who are former Likudniks. A large group of people who nobody knows what they stand for, so they could go easily in any direction. Netanyahu is very shrewd. He could very easily send in feelers and let the people who worked with him in the past, except for Bogi, that will not happen. Bogi will not return to Likud, that's definite. But what? Not with Bibi there, definitely. But there are a few other people who would work with Bibi, and they could very easily, so that it would give him, he can play around with this, like I'm saying. He could, there's so many things that he could do there that he can definitely, like I said, he's the smartest among all the politicians, and he can play them. So,
and he's already, by the way, 5 minutes ago, Netanyahu declared victory. Here's the exact quote. The right wing.
Well, I said that, so he listened to me.
He heard Danny's analysis. The right wing, led by Likud, has won in a clear victory. I thank the citizens of Israel for the trust they have placed in me. I will now begin the process of putting together a right-wing government with our natural partners.
This is better than Game of Thrones. You know, we're waiting for Game of Thrones in 5 days. You know, this is really the real Game of Thrones right now. He is the one sitting there on the throne, and he's the smartest. So I don't see him being surprised by anybody.
I totally agree with Danny. I think that Netanyahu has got the most experience, smart. I think that in politics, you know, when people ask me what I do to relax, I say I watch Game of Thrones to relax, because Israeli politics is really rough. I agree with Danny. Netanyahu is capable. Remember that Blue and White is made up of Lapid, it's made up of Bogi, and it's made up of the Gantz people. He could split this party into 3, offering people all sorts of treats, and in fact that would be a fantastic way for him to destroy the Blue and White party. Just offer them things, and politicians will do what's best for them in the end.
Well, I think it's like there's a collective breath taken out of everybody. We got the initial instincts. There's some questions on the floor. I don't know if we can hand the mic. Dov, you're holding the mic. A lot of people have their hands up. If we can ask this lovely lady over here, if we can somehow get her the microphone. Maybe you can help in the front row. Just help us with the logistics there. Okay. Go ahead. Tell us your name, where you're from, and what's your question.
I'm Jessica. I'm from Texas. And my question is about the representation of Israel in the media. I think that it's really important for a lot of people, especially internationally. The representation of Israel isn't depicted exactly as what's going on here. And I was wondering if any of the parties, namely the top 2, have any platforms or any reforms that they have for representing Israel through international media, or just the international perception of Israel.
So the question relates to the perception of Israel in the media. Danny, you've been dealing with this for decades.
I've been dealing with that for 36 years. No, they don't. I worked with government for 31 years in the Hasbara and media, handling the foreign media. They don't deal with realities. They deal with perceptions. If I ever get my book written, it's been out there for a while, but if it ever gets written, I already have the title. The title is The Cradle of Fake News, and that's here. When all this, the fake news that we hear about, it all started here with the failures of the foreign press in doing their professional duty. And they allowed themselves to be carried away with political narratives and political opinions. This put Israel in a very difficult situation because first, we treated them seriously and thought that they were respectful and honorable, and we treated them that way, and they weren't, and they aren't. The second thing was that we tried to respond to them in a way that, not in sound bites, not in impressions, but tried to be serious about it, and nobody listens to anything serious. By sheer volume of negativity, they created an impression of Israel that I'm sure you at your age, if you're going to college in the States, you've already encountered it. People don't really know what's going on. 10% I say support us, 20% support them, 70% have no idea. Most of that 70% don't really care. But they live off of the impressions. Now with social media, it's even stronger because if social media in many ways could be a good element and get truth out there, in other ways it reflects. And people usually live in their own little bubble, and they're affected by the people around them. So if it's the academia, that's academics and the teachers in the schools, these things don't bode well for Israel. Israel, with the exception of Netanyahu, most of our leaders have no idea what they're doing. They have no idea what they're up against. There's not going to be, and to be honest, after doing it for so many years, I don't think we should care. What we should concentrate on is what is in Israel's best interest, do what's in our interest, and Netanyahu has basically shown that over the past few years. We lived here off of several truths. That we were told that if we don't negotiate, we're not in a constant process of negotiations with the Arabs, we'll be at a disadvantage internationally. People will be against us. We'll be shunned and ostracized. Didn't really happen that way. People respect power in the world. The Americans respect a winner. And when you're a winner, when you're victorious, Israel gets its most support everywhere in the world. Things have changed here in the Middle East. The Palestinian issue, and I say Palestinian in quotes because it was basically created to undermine the legitimacy of the Jewish claim to the land of Israel. So that thing, the Arabs, this golem that the Arabs have created, they've gotten fed up with it. And they understand that they have greater things happening. So in this case, history right now is working in Israel's benefit. We should take advantage of it, and maybe this election has worked to that benefit, that we don't have to worry about people making concessions and making further concessions to the Arabs that will come at the expense not only of Israeli citizens and the lives, but also of Israel's image internationally.
Let's take another. Yeah, we also have a quote.
We have a quote from Benny Gantz. Just in case anybody was doubting, we have won. The people of Israel have spoken. The president of Israel will now place the forming of a government on the correct person. So
he hasn't seen Shimon Peres.
I just wanted to take a moment to disagree with Danny about Israel's image. I don't think we're doing a good enough job, and I understand what we're up against. I really do. But I think that we've been too arrogant and not really brought a proper strategy, a proper ground game. We don't understand that we're fighting a war in the media and we're losing it, and we're not even in the game. And this frustrates me because I come up with people and I speak to people all over the world about Israel. I'm an English speaker. I also speak Spanish. I speak in South America. And most people don't understand the conflict. Most people don't really know the narrative. We haven't done a good job storytelling, and a shame on us because we're so good at everything else. We should put all our best gurus, all our best people into a proper strategy. Everybody speak with the same voice and tell people our marvelous story. We have a great story to sell, and we haven't done it.
We have another.
People just don't care about the story. That's the issue. They don't care. They don't care. What works? Nobody has died as a result of a media assault on Israel. People die in war. And if you don't win the war, and that's what we should be concentrating on, and concentrating not on our image, but on the fact that people realize that we're here to stay, and that's the issue. And we've been too wishy-washy about it. The moment we recognized Palestinian rights is when we started losing our own rights. That was the first mistake. When we stop making those mistakes, people will respect us. And when it comes down to it, at the bottom, until the end of the day, what the world thinks doesn't really matter. What the Jews do is what matters.
We're going to take another question from the floor.
Hi, my name is Ethan. I'm from Maryland. So looking at the exit polls, it looks like when you combine Blue and White and Likud, they're going to be easily over 61. So I guess my question is, what is the chance that we'll get a national unity? And on top of that, what is the chance we get a national unity where Gantz is in the lead rather than Netanyahu as prime minister?
Just in the initial analysis, based on what we've seen, it's unlikely that Gantz will be the one to be asked to form a government, again, based on the results that we've seen so far. Is it possible that Netanyahu is going to reach across and try to bring him in? 100%. He does not want to have a coalition which is teetering around 61, 63, 65. If he could bring in this mammoth called 35, 36 seats, he would do so. At that point, what Danny said is very likely to happen, which is some kind of a split in the blue and white, where Gantz could come in with his, let's say, 18 seats and be defense minister and secure things for Netanyahu, but Yesh Atid, Ya'alon, etc. would fall away and go to the opposition. So it's really unknown, but the chance of Gantz forming a national unity government based on what we've seen so far is something which I see as highly unlikely. Just based on what history has shown, based on what we've seen over here, it would absolutely be Netanyahu who would form the government, would try to reach out to Gantz, try to bring him in, use that as a negotiating chip against the right-wing parties. Meaning if he shows that he has others that he could bring in instead of them, they won't get every single thing which they ask for. He's brilliant at this. There is no one in Israel who is capable of playing this game like Benjamin Netanyahu, and we'll have to see exactly how it plays out.
I think it would be great for the country if there was a national unity government, and then we're not all being extorted by the little parties who have a disproportionate amount of power, because at the end they are the kingmakers. I think that would be fantastic. And I think there's some very good people in the blue and white slate. I think you could take the great ones and make them into good ministers. And somehow, because of Netanyahu's personality, I somehow think he would want to do that also to kind of put down his own ministers in his party and say, I'm still the king. I'm giving out these ministries. Wait in turn. I think it might be a brilliant move for Netanyahu, actually.
We sent our roving reporter, Steve Leibowitz, out onto the streets right before the election to ask them what kind of government they actually wanted to see formed following the elections. Let's hear what they had to say.
What kind of governing coalition would you like to see after the election?
A strong one.
Strong right government. Can that include a unity government or not?
What do you mean by unity? Who's unifying? We want the right to unify.
I would like the Avodah, Meretz, and anybody that can fill in. I would very much like not to have the extremists anywhere near the government.
I want a right-wing government.
Any government that will provide security.
Even a national unity government could?
I don't know who is capable of doing it. That's the confusion.
What kind of government would you like to see formed after the election day?
Central left wing.
Is there a possibility of a unity government at all?
Not between right and left. In between the left and the center.
What kind of government would you like to see formed after the election?
I'm quite happy with the present one. So as far as I'm concerned, it should continue.
I think anybody who's running for anything in the government has to look himself in the mirror and say, when I wake up tomorrow, am I really going to do what I promised the people? Or have I used it as a stepping stone to get to where I want to go and then just do what I want? Because that's politics. That should not be the government.
Are you particularly concerned that Netanyahu is facing indictments?
That I have to be very honest. Anybody who's facing indictment shouldn't be able to run for government.
Not the government that we have today, for sure.
So you would like to see a change?
Of course. Of course.
I would want a government that's based on consensus, and a government which takes egos out of the picture, and a government where those who are elected recognize they're public servants and not out to serve their own individual career paths.
Who are you rooting for
Bibi.
for in the next government?
Bibi. Right wing.
Similar to the government we have today?
No, stronger.
Even stronger?
Yeah.
Well, we actually have brought in for the home stretch, and we're going to go until, for the next 20 minutes or so, continuing analysis, our super panel. We brought back Eve Harrow and Melanie Phillips, and also we're introducing Avi Abulo, the founder of Israel Unwired and the Israel Video Network, to the program. So for you guys that are now just joining the panels, we'd like to hear your thoughts. What does it look like?
Can I say one word? So I just want to say something as someone who was never a member of Knesset but has spent time in the Knesset. Almost all the MKs work very, very hard. And I didn't realize that until I spent time in the Knesset. Okay, they get down to work. They're not just there for their own egos. Most of them work well into the night. They form coalitions. Like the women will all get together to pass something from different parties where they might not agree on anything else, but to pass something important that has to do with women's rights. And I was actually surprised, and I think that we all need to know that. All right, within the Knesset, there's a lot of cooperation and a lot of hard work. Am I wrong?
Yeah, the truth is that was my surprise when I got to the Knesset, because the people who make the headlines are usually the troublemakers, the people who are involved in scandal. Out of 120, so many are there working, and like you said, working across the aisle as well, breaking down barriers. We work together on health, on the environment, on education, on all kinds of issues. And too often the headlines relate to the polarization that's there, but there absolutely is an ability to work together. And on every single slate that we have here, there are very capable people, very quality people, a lot of new people who will be coming in, and it's good to see new people getting a chance to serve, even younger people. There's a nice percentage, not high enough, but of a female representation as well. And I'm going to emphasize, as I always do whenever I speak, and non-Jewish representation. This is a message which people have to understand. Arabs went today and voted in the polls, and by the way, all the reports of low turnout, it seems to be actually higher than was expected, and there will be a nice number of Arab members of Knesset who will be able to work for the needs of the Arab population, but also work together with the Jewish members on issues that relate to all of us. So there's also that part of the Knesset scene and the result for the elections, aside from who actually forms the government.
Melanie?
Well, look, I'm looking at it from British eyes, and it's like wild. It's completely crazy here. I mean, this is extraordinary. You have, the votes are still being counted. As I understand it, the opinion polls, they're clearly all over the place now. But as I understand it, everyone's going to be up all night, and it will be the morning before anybody has the faintest idea what's going on. And you have both Benny Gantz and Netanyahu saying, I've won. Somebody said this has nothing to do with ego. These are titanic egos. All I can see is titanic egos. This is like cavemen politics. I mean, people are just going around beating their chests saying, look at me, I am wonderful. I mean, this strikes me, coming from the madhouse of British politics at the moment. Believe me, it really is a madhouse. Democracy is going down the tubes in Britain. But I mean, this is like, I said before, like bizarre politics. This is bizarre politics.
Well, one of the things that I think came up as the audience really likes that. One of the ideas that democracy was actually being challenged, and I think a lot of people accuse Netanyahu of taking away democracy. Yet Netanyahu has gone to the polls already. This is his 5th time going to the polls in a 13-year span, which is more than most world leaders have to do in order to renew their mandates. 7th time, rather. So in fact, we see that once again, with 47 parties running, with looks like 9 or 10 or 11 parties making the cut, that Israel is actually a hyper-democracy at work, democracy on steroids.
And the truth is, as crazy as it seems and as bizarre as it seems, let's remember, and this is something which we have to be so proud of, at the end of this process, tonight there's going to be counting that's going on with people who are overseeing it. Everyone will have their chance to make sure things were done properly. And when it's all said and done, after all the craziness, on April 30th, there's going to be a new Knesset that's sworn in without a government. There's not going to be any shooting in the streets. There's a smooth transition of power here. And that's something which we as Israelis have to be so proud of in a Middle East, which is filled with dictators who do not go to elections, with military coups. Here we are with all the craziness of the system. We, thank God, have a smooth transition of power. And at the end of the day, there's going to be a government that's going to be serving the people. And again, if they're not appreciated, if people don't want them, we'll have another election cycle and they can be dethroned. But that is the process, and it's something which we cannot emphasize enough to people watching overseas, to remember that with all the craziness that you're seeing and confusion, in the end, there will be a clear winner, there will be a government, there will be a functioning or not functioning government behind this, but Israel continues as a thriving democracy, and that's something which we're so proud of.
Personally, I actually was very worried about the results for this election, even though we do not know what the actual results will be. But I'm not as worried as I was for one reason, based on the conversations that we've already heard from the experts here. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, with whatever faults he has, and we all have faults, he has succeeded in doing so much he has succeeded in accomplishing so much for Israel. In the most dangerous part of the world, survived 8 years of the most hostile U.S. president, and knowing that President Trump has 2 more years of presidency, who is the most pro-Israel president ever, and has allowed all the things to happen, embassy, sovereignty of the Golan, stopping the Iran deal, I was worried that we'd have 2 years wasted of an unexperienced leadership for this country that would not be able to navigate and maximize the relationship with a pro-Israel president in President Trump, as well as the relationship Netanyahu had with President Putin of Russia. And knowing that there is more of a chance that Netanyahu will continue as prime minister to maximize 2 years or maybe even 6 years is a very positive thing in my eyes.
All of us, we spend all of our time trying to explain Israel to the diaspora communities, the Jewish communities, the evangelical communities, the Arab communities, and European communities, everybody around the world, obviously Asian and Southeastern Asian communities. In the United States in particular, and you look at the American Jewish community, and I'll throw this to all of you, even though I know, Avi, you're dealing with this a lot. Obviously, Netanyahu's relationship with President Trump has yielded tremendous results in a short period of time. And yet, many Jews in America who are more liberal actually rue the Prime Minister of Israel for cozying up to the American president, and they actually, because of their own polarized political environment, they sort of feel that Israel may not be in touch with their liberal sensibilities, but at the same time, what other president of the United States does the state of Israel have to work with right now?
Listen, without going, you already discussed diaspora Jewry, connection to Israel, etc., etc. Without going there, one thing can be said. Regardless of an American Jew's feelings for or against President Trump, it is sad, personally sad, that they are not appreciative. And God works in strange ways. I'm a religious Jew. God definitely works in strange ways. And they're not able to appreciate what this president has been able to do, not just for the state of Israel, but for the Jewish people, and strengthening the Jewish people by standing strong for the state of Israel. Their future is better off because of his strong stance with the state of Israel. Again, that is putting aside the internal American domestic issues that they have every right to be against, but then denying and ignoring and sometimes being actively against President Trump and the state of Israel is hurting themselves more than hurting the state of Israel.
If I could just jump in for a moment, only because we've been giving objective analysis, and just for viewers to understand, and obviously a good friend, and we work together, everyone should recognize as well that there's a part of the Israeli electorate, and I'm seeing messages here tonight as well, that didn't want to see Netanyahu reelected, and that's part of democracy, and they're looking at these results, and they're not necessarily happy, or they're hoping that things change overnight. So it's important for people to know that the country is divided on that issue of are they celebrating that victory or not. But again, people will come to terms with whatever those results are. Just one other thing I just want to mention, because people are talking about who the kingmaker will be. Victor Lieberman, a person who everyone assumed this is the end of his career. He had been defense minister and ended up leaving the government, leading ultimately towards these elections. He is certainly in a position right now with 4 seats, 5 seats, whatever it is, where he could play a major role in the formation of the government as well. It's another little piece of news that's just circling around, people recognizing the role that he will play in all of this. And he has already pretty much indicated that he would go with Netanyahu to be the prime minister candidate.
And if I might say, the news story on Lieberman is that both Gantz and Netanyahu are hysterically running after Lieberman in order to attract him to their side. So that's just speaking to what Melanie said about the bizarre. The word being used is both leaders are hysterically running after Lieberman to attract him.
I just wanted to quickly respond to what Dov was said very, very correctly, that yes, the Israeli public is divided in terms of our elections. However, according to all polls that have been publicized, a vast majority of the Israeli electorate is very happy with President Trump and his support of Israel.
I'm going to have to put a little damper on our excitement about the process here in Israel. We forgot one element in the Israeli democratic system. The courts, the Attorney General's office. They're part of the opposition to Netanyahu. And I think that we can already see, because I'm looking at what people are writing here again. Apparently Barak has been on one of the channels, and he's mentioned the fact that there's still these investigations, and he's demanding these investigations be followed through. There are already people who are saying that Netanyahu can't form the government because he has these investigations against him. Therefore, it should be given to Gantz. If Netanyahu does have the ability to form the government, we will be seeing, unfortunately, a very strong involvement of leaks coming out of the police, leaks coming out of the Attorney General's office, all these things to damage the image of the Prime Minister, make it more difficult for him to set up. Nobody's going to go quietly into that dark night here. I can tell you that.
And just to clarify for those who don't know, the Israeli law does allow a prime minister to remain as prime minister even at a stage which we're not at right now, even at a stage where there is an official indictment against the prime minister, which there isn't. It's important to emphasize that. The prime minister will be having a hearing at some point probably in the summer, so we have a few months. That's after the formation of government. And therefore, they will argue that that should play a role in the president's decision. But if the president is following what the law determines, so to speak, which is he does have the freedom to choose someone, that, based on Israeli law itself, should not be a factor in forming the government.
And one of the first laws that the Likud want to pass is this law that a prime minister or any sitting member cannot be charged until after they finish. That's to stop this attempt to replace or to get rid of an elected official not through the polls and not through the public. And because Netanyahu has been the Israeli public's choice now for over 10 years. And those who do not accept him have been trying everything. And those who claim to be most concerned about our democracy are the ones that you see the first to use every undemocratic way of unseating an elected prime minister.
Right, and it's also a little bit disingenuous claims like by Barak when it's clear that the Israeli electorate has factored in all of those indictments into their decision when they went to the polls, and whether or not Likud comes out with the most votes in the election, and we'll only probably know that tomorrow. It's clear that even by the lowest estimates, he's received more mandates than he received in any previous election, potentially. So certainly Israelis have rallied behind him, even despite the looming indictments that are pending hearing. And I also saw another interesting fact, which I think goes underreported. There was a statistic put out by the Israeli Democracy Institute, which said that when an indictment is pending a hearing, in 39% of the cases, that the indictment does not take place following the hearing.
I think the Prime Minister did a very good job in explaining that to people, because I think that initially there was more concern amongst but his message over and over again of, I have not had my chance to make my case. In many cases when people do that, the charges are removed. That is something which I think he did a very good job in sort of sweeping this issue away when people actually went to vote.
It's not only the Prime Minister. Any legal advisor or any legal expert has been saying that this has been deliberately blown out of proportion by the Israeli media. And are we surprised that once again the Israeli media have been wrong in their estimates, their assessments, their evaluation of the situation here? Who's been pushing Zehut, for example? It's been the Israeli media. Anything to try to take away seats that could be definitely for the right wing. So, because Zehut was very questionable where they were going to be. So once again, the Israeli media is exposed for its bias.
Eve.
Yeah, and that's why I would hope that if Ayelet Shaked isn't back in the Justice Ministry, which right now tonight it looks like she won't be, that whoever is will continue the work that she did in order to have the court system be where it should be in a democratic country and not where it is right now, which is kind of like a fiefdom all on its own. So we'll see what happens with that too.
Just hot off the press, Gantz has tried to reach out to Aryeh Deri of the Shas Party to try to begin discussions, and he was given a response of, we're not talking with you, we're supporting Netanyahu. So you see that the attempts are being made behind the scenes, and those steps have already been taken.
Well, I actually want to, Eve, ask.
The one thing we can guarantee in this country is nobody has ever or will ever died of boredom. So stay tuned.
You know, these are very exciting times for the state of Israel.
Chinese curse, isn't it?
We have numerous internal challenges, domestic challenges. We have financial challenges, socio-economic challenges, religious challenges, security challenges. But at the same time, as Eve's mentioning, you know, this broadcast is taking place just several meters away from the Western Wall, just several meters away from the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, just several meters away from which is the Temple Mount, of course, where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is just meters from here. And what that means is that people have had their eyes on this real estate here, on this holy city of Jerusalem for thousands of years. And perhaps intensified focus on this place more than any other place. And it's really a privilege to be able to live here at such tumultuous times in the world, and at the same time to see the state of Israel and the city of Jerusalem rising at this time. And we've witnessed, just in the times that we've all lived here, we've seen Israel come from a developing nation into a world superpower, a military power, an economic power. Much of that's been done with Netanyahu, either as the prime minister or the finance minister or the foreign minister, but also with Benny Gantz and Bogi Ya'alon and Gabi Ashkenazi running the military of the state of Israel. So once again, we have very talented people that are all committed to bringing this state forward. Each of us, all of us that have decided to leave the places of our births and to come and be part of the Jewish mission, it's something that we all take very seriously. It's something very important to be proud of. And I would really like to thank all of our college students for joining us tonight. You've really been a fantastic audience. I'd like to thank our producers, Yuda Wadowski and his team put together an incredible broadcast. Our field reporter and producer, Steve Leibowitz, he's done an amazing job. All of our talented panelists. I want to give special thanks also to Aisha Torah. They gave us their Kirk Douglas Auditorium in their World Center for this broadcast. They are an incredible organization that really does tremendous outreach to Jews around the world and helps people get in touch with their Jewish identity in many different ways. And so I'd urge all of you to check them out online. You can find them at aish.com. And also stay tuned. Keep watching and reading JNS. We really have tried over the past year to step up our game and to really explain what's going on in the state of Israel and concerns in the Jewish world, whether they be in Washington, D.C. or Jerusalem, Europe, or anywhere else. As well, we're not better than any of the competition. So keep reading, keep watching, keep staying engaged, keep being part of the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, the state of Israel. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.